Hello everybody, welcome to Oil Painting 101. Thank you for joining me here at the studio today. The reason I wanted to do this was for a lot of our students are starting to approach painting within our program. And what I want to do is make sure that you go into the painting program with some information under your belt, because a lot of times oil painting can be overwhelming and you don't know what supplies to buy, what colors to get, what brushes to get, what surfaces to get. So I wanted to do a kind of a mini lecture on the basics of oil painting. This handout is, I'm going to have this available on the students only page. So if you lose it or you want to refer to it again, those of you who are ARA students can access it on the students only page. Or if you're not, you can always just email me and say, you know, I lost my copy. Can you just send it to me? But this is kind of the coverage of information that we're going to talk about today. But I am also going to cover a couple other things I'm hoping to get to that people had asked about in advance. So this is an example of a cast painting on the cover. This is one of our student works. And the assignments that we do here within the program, for those of you who are approaching painting within our program, you're going to be familiar with a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about with cast painting, things like value, things like drawing, things like shape, all that type of stuff. But just because you've mastered drawing, you've got all these skills in your subconscious, they're automatic, you're always thinking about drawing, you're always thinking about value. But now as you move to painting, you're starting the same stuff except with a totally new medium. So instead of doing it in pencil or charcoal, now we're going to be doing the same stuff in paint. And paint is a very fickle medium, and it does not always do what you want it to do. So the good thing about having those drawing skills and rendering skills under your belt is you're going to want to know what you want it to look like, but your hand might not do it. And the paint might not do it. And so that's really what we're trying to do here. And I do feel like if you understand a little bit about what your medium is doing and why it's acting a certain way, you have more control. So a little bit of technical knowledge can be really, really helpful. And so for you to troubleshoot on your own, because I can't hold your hand. I'm not always going to be with you in the studio. So I want to make sure you feel confident about being able to troubleshoot and adjust things within your process. Okay, and at any point in time, if you have questions, please don't be afraid to stop me. I'll probably just repeat the question so that it's on the audio. This will be recorded so that you guys can rewatch it again, or for future students who are in our drawing program approaching the painting program. Okay. So the first thing I want to get into is the general safety about oil painting. There are some unique challenges with oil painting that you have to consider that are different than acrylic or watercolor or gouache and things like that. So the intro and general safety, the first thing is, other than the fact that it can be overwhelming and that I want you to take this information and feel confident about it, is don't eat your paint. I know that seems really obvious, but a lot of times people come to me with concerns about oil painting being toxic. Anything can be toxic if you eat it or rub it into open wounds. So we're going to start out with saying don't eat your paint. Okay, so I use lead white for my white. Lead white is toxic if you eat it, but it is not toxic if you're just painting with it. If you're extra concerned because you tend to I don't know, lick your fingers a lot, wear gloves. So there's some basic safety that you can do to, make sure you're not eating it. So anytime you're painting and you go to have lunch, wash your hands. You'll find you'll get sick a lot less during the winters if you're just, oh, I'm done painting for right now, I'm going to go wash my hands. Don't wash your hands after painting. So if you get like paint, any paint is you could eat a tube of raw umber, but I don't recommend it. It is, it's actually digestible, but it's probably not delicious. So, okay. So when you do wash your hands, just use soap and water. Soap is going to break down the oils, right? So it's probably the same with acrylics and watercolors. So like if you get it on your hands, just wash it with soap and water, you're fine. Don't use solvent to wash your hands. Now, this is something I used to do when nobody told me how to use oil paints, I used to say, oh, I got all this paint on myself. I'm going to take solvent or turpentine. Yeah, bad idea. So don't do that. Okay, because that's just, you don't want to get solvent. Solvents are the bad thing. When people talk about toxicity or danger, not dangers, but like things to think about, it's solvents. And you don't want to be breathing in a ton of solvents and you don't want to be rubbing it on your skin. Okay, so just soap and water when you're washing your hands. Okay. When you're washing your brushes, what I would recommend, especially if you're painting at home, because you don't want to be clogging up your plumbing with paint. So acrylic paints are dissolvable in water, right? And watercolors are as well. So they're gonna, when you clean your brushes, everything tend to go down the sink. But with oil paints, we don't want to do that. And here's my recommendation for washing brushes. So I'm just going to talk about this one tank for now. I know this looks disgusting, but this is just a cleaning tank that you can get at or you could just use a jelly jar with a sponge at the bottom. It doesn't have to be, I just like to buy these because they have a coil at the bottom. So if I had paint on my brush, I would just take my brush and I'd rub it. This has linseed oil in it, just straight linseed oil. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. And I'm going to agitate the brush in there, and that's going to pull a lot of those paint particles out of the brush, and they'll be suspended in the oil. Okay, so that's great. And over time, the paint is just going to settle at the bottom. And what you have after you do that is basically an oily brush, right? That's fine. Now what do you do with it? Just soap and water in the sink. So this way you're taking all the paint, any lead paint, any cadmiums, any of that paint is mostly in your cleaning tank and not going down into the water supply. Okay, so we're trying to minimize. So usually what I like to do, if this is really gunky with paint, I'll wipe it off with a paper towel first. That gets a lot out. And then agitate, 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 wipe off, oily brush. Okay, and that can just be soap and water. Soap can be any type of soap. I like to use Fell's Naphtha. It's a cheap laundry soap that is available on Amazon in like packs of like 200. They're great, and it's a laundry soap. It's a bar, so I just use Fell's Naphtha. But you could also use like the Masters soap, which is like a painting soap. You could also just use Ivory soap. It's just soap breaking down oils. So it's really cheap and easy. You just want to make sure you get as much pigment out of there as possible. A lot of times people say, why is my brush really junky? Well, part of it's because you didn't wash enough pigment out of it, and then you have it kind of jammed in the ferrule, right? So you want to just make sure you're washing that brush really well, lathering it up, and then rinsing it off, right? But you should have most of the pigment out if you agitated it in the linseed oil. Okay, so that's just a way for you to keep your plumbing clean, and that's a way for you to make sure your brushes stay good for longer, and just in general, a good idea to wash your brushes that way. And then this will eventually get dirty, right? So you can kind of see that my oil is kind of clear, but there you can see if I started to move this around, the paint on the bottom starts to mix into it. To get rid of this, I usually have like a big spaghetti jar that's been rinsed out, and I just say, I mix it all up and pour it in there. And then I'll put new linseed oil in the cleaning tank. After a month or two, do the same thing. Once that spaghetti jar gets full, every town has a toxic waste day where you just go and give the town your house paint, your solvent, like anything like that. And you just pull up and say, here's my oil, paint, and solvent, and they'll take it. They dispose of it. Okay, does that make sense? Any questions about that? Okay, so that's just cleaning brushes. That's just safety or not safety, but best practices of not gunking up your plumbing and things like that. There's also a video, if you get the digital version of this, there's a link on how to wash your brushes if you want, or if you go here, I can also show that to you at some point. This is the really, really big thing. The big difference is the disposing of oily paper towels or rags. So acrylic paints are water-based, right? So in watercolors, they dry by evaporation. So that's a very fast process. And when you get paint on your clothing, it dries very fast and actually sets super fast, right? So when you get oil paint on a rag, paper towels, rags, anything that is flammable, the oil paint itself is not flammable. You cannot take a tube of paint and light it on fire. But here's a problem. Oil does not dry by evaporation. Oil paints stay wet for a long time, right? It's because they're made with oil, and oil dries by a totally different process, and that process is oxidation. So it needs oxygen, and it's also a chemical process, meaning it gives off heat when it dries. So a lot of times you'll hear about car mechanics or studios that go up in flames, and it's not because somebody lit something on fire. It's because they have paper towels or rags bunched up, meaning all that heat is getting stuck inside all of those flammable rags, and if the temperature reaches a certain point, it's going to spontaneous combust. So we here at the school, if you're painting here at the school, we have, this is called an oily waste bin. And the reason it's an oily waste bin is because we have the danger of that spontaneous combustion. Come on in. Here's the thing that's really nice about this is number one, there's an automatic closing. So that means it's gonna not give it oxygen, okay? And it's automatic, so you step on this and it opens and it automatically closes. And we're also emptying this every night and trying to like get it out of the building. These are like excessive precautions. But that's because we just want to make sure that if something does start to build up heat as it's oxidizing in there, it doesn't have access to the oxygen. Now, if you're painting at home and you don't have one of these, there's a couple things that you can do to mitigate that. So I would recommend having, I like the dog waste bags. They're relatively cheap. So what I do is at home, I'll take all of my oily paper towels and I'll take one of those waste bags and I'll put a little bit of water in it because that's going to keep the combustible material wet, and then it won't oxidize and then I tie off the bag because it's no oxygen. Does that make sense? So I'm just doing kind of, and then I'll dispose it outside. I'm like layer after layer of fire safety. Okay, so we're really trying to avoid the buildup of heat within those paper towels and or rags. Okay, the other option is, and I've done this before, I just hang up my rags on like a clothesline and let them just kind of air out and dry for a couple days, and then you can just throw them out in the garbage, right? Because all that, once it's dried, that heat's really finished giving off. Any questions about the safety stuff?
Can you get those on Amazon too?
You can. You can even get smaller ones. Obviously, we have big ones here, but I do recommend, they're nice because you just like use your foot, put it in there, and you don't have to think about it. And then at the end of the day, we just make sure it's disposed of every day.
So does every town or city though, do they have special rules about then? Like you said, you bring it outside. Can it just go with the regular trash, or are there any other?
Those, if I do oily waste, or sorry, oily rags in a waste bag with some water and I tie it off, I just put it in my regular garbage outside, just in case. Again, it's layer on layer of safety. Yeah. All right. Anything that is a solvent is flammable. So the oil paint itself is not flammable. The solvent that we're going to talk about, or turpentine, examples of solvents are turpentine, terpenoid, Gamsol, anything that is a solvent of any kind is flammable. So you don't want to have that sitting around an open fire. I don't know why you'd be painting next to a fire. But okay. And like we already talked about the disposing of the dirty oil or solvent. Everything kind of goes into that one spaghetti jar and then I let the town deal with it. All right. Any questions about that?
I have a question.
Yes.
They have the solvent-free medium now. Is that disposing of the rags in the same process with that?
Yeah. So the question was that with the solvent-free paints or the solvent-free mediums, that's still going to be an oil-based thing. Okay. And when it dries, it's still going to dry through a chemical process. If solvent dries by evaporation, it's like water, but it is flammable, right? So it's more of like think of like gasoline. It's like it's a solvent. You can clean things with it. It's going to get rid of sticky residue, and it's also going to light on fire if you light it. Okay, but that dries by evaporation. Oils dry by oxidation. Water, solvent, dry by evaporation. Those are fast processes of drying. Oil is a slower process for drying. Yeah, make sense? Okay, let's move on to, let's learn a little bit about our paint in general. So this is going to seem a little rudimentary, but it never hurts to just assume you guys know absolutely nothing. So what is oil paint? It seems pretty obvious as paint made with oil, but just in case, our labels are really helpful in understanding what our paint is made of or with. So oil paint is literally oil with paint pigment in it. So if you think about dry pigment, you've probably seen dry pigment before, or like it kind of looks like a chalky, dusty thing. And it's literally just the chalk, the pigment that is ground up and mixed into oil. So the oil is the thing that holds it all together. That is what we call a binder. Okay, and then the pigment itself are the pigment particles. So we can kind of think of our paint in the tube, like this is my tube of paint. I'm really good at drawing, but not quickly. Okay, so that's our tube of paint. So we have literal paint particles that are suspended in our see-through oil. Okay, this is the oil, and then these are our little particles, right? That's literally all paint is. And if we understand that, there's things that we can understand about when we do layer them, or how it's going to be affected by things we add to it. Okay, and if we look at our label, we can learn what the pigment is, what the oil is, and some properties about the paint. So what I have here is an example of the Michael Harding's Scarlet Lake. And so Michael Harding is the manufacturer. It's a pretty solid line of paint, a little bit on the higher end. If you're looking for a really good starter set, a starter brand for paints, I'm a big fan of Winsor Newton. It's very economical, but I feel like the quality is really high. Okay, I'm not a huge fan of the Gamblin paints because of their consistency, or it's also known as the viscosity of the paint, but the consistency of it's a little stiff. I like a little bit more of a flow to the paint right out of the tube. I prefer Winsor Newton to start with. I think it's a really good economical brand, and it's also a, we'll talk about the difference between student grade and artist grade in a minute. The name of the color here is Scarlet Lake. So that's the name of the color. That's not the pigment that's used. That's like our nickname for it. So you'll find that, you know, a Michael Harding Scarlet Lake versus a different brand Scarlet Lake, they aren't exactly the same, and that is super irritating. But it is useful to know that they consider them similar, but they're not. But what you really are going to want to take a look at is the pigment name that is in it. So this is made with a PR, purple, is it pigment red? Yeah, pigment red. So it's PR, like a PW would be pigment white. PY is pigment yellow, okay? So it's PR 170, which is also known as naphthol azo. Ooh. But you'd probably see across most brands, they're all using the same pigment, but it might be a different source of the pigment. It might be a different way of treating the pigment. You're gonna find that there's variations brand to brand, but this is how you can just understand what your paint is made with. The really fun thing is when you get it, when you're at the store, you have all these lovely colors in front of you, right? And if you look at the actual pigments they're made with, you actually might find you already have that pigment, because King's Blue, for example, is this lovely lavender blue. If you look at the pigments it's made with, it's just PW6, which is titanium white, and PB, I think it's 19, which is ultramarine blue. So if you have ultramarine blue and you have titanium white, you already have King's Blue. It's a convenience color. Okay, so if you're looking at a tube of paint and it's only made with one pigment, you're not going to be able to replicate that exactly unless you have that pigment. If you have a mixture, a convenience color, you already have that. Okay, so I'm not a big fan of spending a ton of money when I don't need to. So this is just ways for you to understand what you're buying and what's worth spending money on. If you tend to make a lot of that mixture over and over and over and over and over again, maybe it's useful to buy a tube of King's Blue because you're like, it'll save me a shortcut. Does that make sense? That's a convenience color. All right, so it has the manufacturer, the name of the color, the pigment name, and then the binder or oil that is used. So this, in this case, it is linseed oil. And for now, if you're just starting with oil painting, you don't have to care what it's made with. Just assume it's a tube of paint and you're going to use it. As you get more experience or you have different preferences, you may feel like I would prefer something that was in a walnut oil, or maybe I want to make my own pigments or make my own paints and I want to make it with a safflower oil, right? So that's picky. that's when you get, I'm at the point where I'm very picky about what I use. And right, if you're just starting to learn or you're just getting into oil paints, you don't have to worry about it. It's just for you to know that what it's made with. Okay, does that make sense? The other thing to be concerned about is the light fastness. That is, and I don't know if this is the same with watercolor and or acrylics, but with light fastness, that means how robust the color is going to be over time when exposed to UV light. So good light fastness means it's not going to fade over time. If it's a fugitive color or bad light fastness, it means that the more it's exposed to UV light, it's going to gray down. So a perfect example of this is alizarin crimson. And alizarin crimson is a beautiful color. It's on my palette, but I prefer to get alizarin crimson permanent. It's a different pigment number than traditional alizarin crimson, which is fugitive. Over time, that paint will go grayer and grayer when exposed to UV light. Okay, so, and they have the light fastness rating for that paint, should be on the label. Okay, so I tend to look for more light fast stuff. Some people don't mind, and actually if you get, like this is a tube of quinacridone opera, which is ridiculous in terms of high chroma. It's a beautiful paint, but I believe the light fastness of this is really crappy. So this is gonna fade in chroma over time. Okay, so it's really up to you on if that's something you wanna.
What if you put it under UV glass?
So if you put the painting under UV glass, it might help. I also don't want to put my paintings under glass. That's kind of that's a lot cheaper to frame. So yeah, you probably could, but it also, everything has its pros and cons. So that might help. I don't know the answer to that. Because I also asked, was when we varnish, this comes later, but when we varnish, a lot of the varnishes have a UV stabilizer in them. So I do think that probably helps to some degree, but I don't know how much of an impact that has. Okay, and then it also says the transparency of the paint. So that, is it semi-opaque, is it transparent, or is it fully opaque? This is going to come in handy when we start talking about these color charts that I recommend people do. But the opacity of the paint can vary incredibly dramatically. And I believe this is the same color, it's the same with acrylics. Watercolors tend to be much more transparent because the nature of it is to be suspended in the water. But with oil paints, the transparency from brand to, or from pigment to pigment, very different. Okay, so things to note is not all of the same color across brands are gonna be the same. I kind of mentioned that earlier. This is also why I do pigment tests, and I'll talk about these in a minute, but this is also why I do this, not only to see the transparencies and feel it out, but to also see what is different brand to brand. When you are first starting out with oil painting, I recommend just sticking with one brand. Just start by being consistent across the board and using that color until you know it like the back of your hand, because then when you do go to make a change or try a different brand or color, you're going to have something to compare it to. Okay, so if you're kind of always jumping around, you never really fully understand or fully are familiar with what decision you're making and why. Does that make sense? So it doesn't mean that you have to be the same brand across all of your paints. I'm just saying being consistent with each paint that you use, have it be the same brand every time. If it's a Michael Harding yellow ochre and you just keep using that, great. Just be consistent. It helps for you to learn faster. Anytime the word hue is used on your paint tube, it's a replacement. It's a knockoff version, okay? So that hue term, if it's like a phthalo blue hue, they've tried to use a couple different other pigments to simulate it at a lower price. So you have very cheap paints like raw umber, burnt umber, some like more modern colors are cheaper. So to make a vermilion hue, vermilion can be very expensive, right? So if they're making a vermilion hue, they might be taking some cad red, adding a little cad yellow, and simulating approximately what vermilion will do in a paint mixture, but it's never exactly the same. So the hue is usually a knockoff brand of that color, okay? And another thing when you go to buy paints, the differences between a couple tubes of paint are the words light, medium, and deep. Have you ever seen that? So cad yellow light, cad yellow deep. What the heck is the difference? If you look at the labels, they're all made with the same pigment. It's all the same PY pigment. So why is it different? When you take that pigment and you heat it at different temperatures, it starts to shift color. Am I right, Andrew? Okay, so he's my chemist. So he's my chemist. So if I were to buy a cad yellow, when I first started learning, my yellow was Winsor Newton Cad Yellow Pale. Love it. It's a great color. But it's made with safflower oil, so I was hoping to find a cad yellow made with linseed oil because linseed oil tends to dry faster. So I started exploring other brands. And when I bought a Rublev Cad Yellow Pale, it was completely different. It was like lemon cold yellow. And I was like, well, that's not what I wanted. So what I needed to do was explore the other brands or things that would be similar to my cad yellow pale. So here's what happens with, like, for example, a cad yellow. A straight up cad yellow or cad yellow medium is going to lean a little bit more neutral in the yellow, in kind of like the yellow area, right? If we're talking about yellows. Now, if I look at cad yellow deep actually looks a little bit more orangey and it's a little bit darker. So it's a shift of that cad yellow. If you look at cad yellow light, it's a slight shift towards a greener or bluer yellow. Does that make sense? So when you see a light, a medium, deep, it's usually a slight shift across the color wheel. Same thing with cad red. Cad red deep shifts a little bit more purple, a little bit darker. Cad red light shifts a little bit more orange and a little bit lighter. Okay, so you can choose which one you feel like is going to be most useful for what you're looking to do. In my typical palette, we'll talk about what some recommended palettes would be for you guys, but I like a cad red light because it does shift a little bit more orangey and a little bit more brighter in value. Okay, any questions about that? So the shift, the light, medium, deep, what's the difference? Just how the pigment was treated, you're going to see that there's a shift in what they look like between each other, and it's usually kind of right in the same color wheel kind of family, but it shifts one way or the other. Okay, and this is also the same for other paints as well.
You mentioned like using different oils. Can you combine?
Yeah, like I'm saying, when you're first starting, don't worry about what the paint's made with. This is me painting after 10 years and getting really picky and like wanting things to dry faster. So I'm like, slightly shifting off. I started with all Winsor Newton and it was great. But I've slowly shifted. Like I now use a Blue Ridge Yellow Ochre, which is a natural pigments brand. And what I like about this is it's much more chromatic. It's much more colorful of a yellow ochre than Winsor Newton's yellow ochre. And I found that it was more versatile for how I paint. Everything's really personal, but it's still like, that's the shift I made pretty early. I still do use Winsor Newton, like for my permanent alizarin crimson. Still love this paint. I know I can paint with this with my eyes closed because I just know it so well. And you can see I've made shifts over the years, but in terms of paints, again, be consistent while you're like getting your feet underneath you, and then make changes based on your knowledge of what you're currently using and how it's different from what you're now trying out. Okay. Student grade paint is fine, but it's also deceivingly expensive. And this is why. So this is our nice artist grade tube of paint, which is just our pigment and our binder. Actually, maybe I should use a different color for the binder. Let's do that. I'm loving using drawing erase boards for this. Okay, so we'll make Our pigments are going to be red. Obviously, there's a lot more than 7 or 8 pieces of pigment in your thing. And then our binder is going to be this green. So that's kind of holding all those, that dust together. Okay. So a student grade paint also puts in, it's kind of like raisins and trail mix. They make it cheaper by putting more raisins in. So it's like these little, like clear, sometimes it's marble dust, it's filler. Okay. So what happens is if when you're adding this cad red to a mixture, if you have filler, the filler's not really doing anything. So you're going to find that student grade paints, while they're just as valid as anything else, they're just weaker. They're not, they use the term pigment load. The pigment load is less, so it's kind of like a wimpy, it's like a wimpy paint, right? And some people, if you get used to wimpy paint, and you can do amazing things with student grade paints, but if you're, trying to get a good bang for your buck, you're not actually getting more for less. You're just getting less for less. Okay. When you're just starting out, again, it's totally up to you. I know budgets are not, it's not always easy to just like invest a ton, but student grade paints, I know people, some phenomenal artists who use student grade paint. So if you are like, I just really need to stay on budget for a while, you could get student grade paint. You're going to get used to student grade paint. But if you switch to a higher pigment load, more expensive paint later on, you're going to need to recalibrate mixing a little bit, right? Because adding, let's say we'll do cooking, adding a tablespoon of cad red to a mixture of student grade paint is going to be a lot weaker and a lot less red than if you add a teaspoon of a Michael Harding or a Rublev cad red, where it's going to be like, right? It's going to annihilate the mixture. So it's more of you recalibrating. Make sense? Okay, any questions about that? So student grade, still, it's good for, it's fine, but just know what you're getting. Okay, and then I think I covered everything else on here. And okay, so recommendations for starting out. The first thing, before I get into the recommended palettes, especially for our ARA Boston students who are going to be joining the painting program, I'll talk about the recommended palettes. Or if you're just starting out with doing oil painting, I do think starting out with a controlled palette is a really great way to like understand what's happening. But what I do recommend doing in general when you're first starting, I mean, I think you should also do this for watercolor and acrylics or any other type of medium, which is understand what your paint's personality is. So let's see, this is a good example, and here's a good example. So these are color charts, okay? So there's ways that whenever I get a new tube of paint, there's ways that I test it out, which actually I think did I start talking about this? This is under the recommended exercises, so I'm kind of jumping ahead to that, but this is a recommended exercise, especially those of you studying with us. So doing a color chart, it doesn't have to be on this nice fancy little thing. It could just be on a white canvas. It doesn't have to cost you a lot of money. But every tube of paint you should have, I recommend doing this. And that is testing it once totally opaque out of the tube. That is full coverage. Try to completely cover that a square or section of the paint out of the tube. So you know what it looks like out of the tube, because when it's in the tube, this is not really that helpful, because it kind of gives you an approximate idea, but this is going to act as a reference or a library to what your paints are going to do. Okay, so the first thing that we're doing is this fully opaque strip here so this is Rublev's Orange Molybdate, Gamblin's Naphthol Scarlet, Old Holland Vermilion. So you can see here, out of the tube, they kind of all look kind of similar. You can see Cad Red Deep is darker and more purple. My Permanent Alizarin Crimson, you can see it's actually really hard to get it fully opaque. And that tells you right out of the gate, it's super transparent. It's very oily. You can see through it, and it's hard to make a solid statement with it, right? So this is information that you're going to take into painting, okay? So the first thing I see is what it looks like out of the tube. That's helpful. The next 2 squares here, now I only put 3 squares in the handout because this is more than you really need. So this is white surface. Okay, so my next test was, what does this paint look like a little bit more transparent, see-through? Okay, so what we're doing here is, so we have our nice little paint there. So if with a thick layer of paint, this is oil paint. We have all of those little pigment particles really crammed up next to each other. The binder is still all holding it together, right? It's still holding it together, but it's really dense. All of the pigment's really packed in. So what happens is the light comes, some is absorbed, but the rest of the stuff that's not absorbed is reflected, right? So when I take a white surface, our white surface, we wear white in the summer, right? Because it reflects light and it keeps us cool. So white surface reflects a lot of paint, a lot of light. So when we do this, when we test transparency, what we want to do is see how the paint is going to look when it's thinned out over the surface. So what's happening is these little paint particles are getting spread further apart, okay? And our binder is still holding it together. Any more hands? This is what happens when I'm painting with brushes too. And what happens is the light comes through and it's able to actually get in between those, hits that white surface and then bounces back. And so it almost acts like a stained glass. The chroma, the color of it like really comes out and it looks lighter because we can see that more of that white is kind of influencing it. So you notice how much brighter these two squares are than the opaque version. And they're much more colorful looking. They're almost like much more neon. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the concept of glazing. We're not going to do glazing when we first start painting yet. No glazing until we get to still life. But glazing and working transparently, this is at least giving you, like, this is what my color, the maximum it can be. Does that make sense? The maximum color. In a watercolor, people who are used to watercolor are used to this, right? You're using a white paper and you're doing thin washes and letting the paper kind of be that illuminating factor. Okay, this is also why Boston School painters or impressionists will often paint on a white surface, or paint on a white canvas, because they're trying to maximize that color and chroma using that lit from behind feel. Any questions on that? Okay, so I tested out opaque, I tested out transparent. Now this is just 2 levels of transparency. Some it's kind of transparent and then as transparent as I can get without it looking washed out. Okay, the next thing I do is I mix it with white, because here's what's going to happen. When I start, white is the most prevalent color that you're going to be mixing into everything else. Okay, so our white paint, definitely use the white you plan to use in your paintings. Use that white to mix it with your pigment, because what's going to happen is, notice that these two look very different. They have different feels to them. It looks a little bit more chalky, the chroma is a little bit lower. So just because you're mixing it with white, you're going to naturally get a drop in chroma, and you're going to get, it'll lighten in value, but it'll drop in chroma. So here's a lighten in value, but increase in chroma. This is mixing with white. Look at how much this Cad Red Deep dropped in chroma. Okay, so that really drops in chroma when I mix it with white. That's something for me to notice. That's something for me to take note of in general, that if I start using Cad Red Deep and I want really colorful reds in my lighter values, it's not going to happen. Okay. So these two are both transparent rows. So these are both transparencies. One's just more, this is less transparent and more transparent. And then this is just a lighter value mixed with white and a darker value mixed with white. So these are both mixed with white, just to different values. Because you're going to find that your pigments mix differently. There are some colors that hold their pigment, hold that chroma. The more white you add, they still stay super chromatic. So one of those is like the quinacridone rose. I do think that Old Holland's Cad Red Light, that's a pretty nice colorful note here and also here. But I do find that like the alizarin crimson tends to drop faster. The Winsor Newton Cad Red tends to drop a bit faster. You're just taking note of kind of like what happens. Now, this is me comparing brands and comparing reds, but just even having this for the 9 paints I'm going to recommend for a full palette, just even doing the same thing with just these 9 paint is going to be useful. It's like a visual library for you to understand what's going to know what to expect in a way. So you're also going to find that another thing you learn through this is the fact that our paints are going to tint at different strengths. I call this like being a bully or being like easy to get along with. So you're going to find that different paints have different personalities. Your alizarin crimson is a bully. It really starts to stain and take over mixtures, and it really wants to be noticed. It wants attention. Whereas our earth colors like yellow ochre or raw umber or burnt umber, they tend to get along a little bit better. They're not like, they're just there for for a good time. And then there's colors that are super weak. They're like wallflowers, like a cobalt violet. You have to dump like a gallon of it in a mixture to really make a big difference. So you're gonna find that the different personalities, you're getting used to these 9 paints, you're going to start knowing automatically how much of each thing to add because you are so familiar with them and their tinting strength and their chroma levels and how they mix with white. So you're going to be able to make better color mixing decisions when you understand the properties of what your paints are going to do. Yes.
Sorry, what white do you use for your testing?
What white do I use? So I like to, my preferred white is lead white. And if there's time, I can show a demonstration on the different mixing properties of each. But the 2 whites I recommend you using are either titanium white or lead white. And lead white tends to be a little bit weaker. It's a little bit more transparent, and it plays really nicely with colors. However, the transparency of it is really annoying at times, and it makes me want to use titanium, but then I hate titanium because it's a bully of a pigment. You get a little bit of titanium in something and it chalks it up so bad. So I'll deal with the transparency of lead because the other properties of it I like. So there's more pros for it than cons. So I use lead white. I like Natural Pigments Lead White #1, which is made with linseed oil, which means it's very fast drying. Question?
Yeah, the 2 rows of transparency, is that diluted with something or is it just more paint?
Good question. Are the transparency rows diluted with anything to make them more transparent? Some of them yes, some of them no. So remember we talked about alizarin crimson being super transparent out of the gate? I don't need to add anything. I can just kind of scrub it thinner and scrub it even thinner because it's already oily, it's already transparent. So it doesn't need any extra movement or vehicle or more binder to like make it more thin. It's already naturally thin. But you're gonna find that a more opaque color like a Cad Red or even this orange molybdate, whatever that was, it covers really well, which is a good thing. But to try to scrub it thinner, like I have to be more aggressive with scrubbing it thinner, or I might add a little bit of oil. I don't want to add a ton because you're going to end up with a soupy mess. Okay, little bit. I try to add nothing to my paint if possible. The less stuff you add to your paint, the more control you will have and the more deliberate you can be with the paint. If you're adding a lot of medium to it, you end up with a wet, soupy, uncontrolled mess. Okay? Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Yep.
When we do more transparency to maintain higher chroma and a lighter value.
Yeah.
Is that considered a glaze?
Yes. And that's where, like, when you're first starting painting with us here at the program, everything we do is opaque. Everything. So all 3 cast paintings. The first one is grisaille. That's just black and white. Totally opaque. Every layer, totally opaque. Second painting is a limited palette. Every layer, totally opaque. And that's because opacity is absolutely repeatable, controllable, and reliable. There's no like, oh, I think the thing that was under it was different. Transparency brings in endless, infinite variety of possibilities. And that's the beauty of oil paint. So we will get there, and it's amazing to do. And that's what we start to address when we reach still life painting. When we do cast painting, we're trying to master the reliable and repeatable, and that is full opacity. So we're going to be using that for still life, but not for cast. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Did that answer your question? Okay. So it is glazing, and our first still life assignment is red cloth with a white shiny object. So the red cloth is where we start playing around with how do we use building up whites in a piece of fabric in order to like glaze and make that high chroma rather than mixing it, because we know mixing it at a high value is going to drop the chroma. So we're using a bright cherry red piece of fabric, creating forms with it, and then learning how to use glazing as part of our process. Because up until now we've been on opaque, 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 opaque. But now we're going to go opaque, build up whites, thin glaze, render other sections. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay. So when you're first starting to learn, I recommend working mostly opaquely. So these little color charts are great. They're Color Frontier is the brand, but you can just get a piece of canvas. I recommend using the canvas that you're probably going to be trying to paint on anyways. Just get a white surface and do these fully opaque out of the tube, thinned and scrubbed down thinly over white and mixed with white. You're going to get a ton of information out of these color charts and color tests. So here I can see the difference between brands. If I have a Michael Harding Cad Red versus a Natural Pigments Cad Red, I can see how they differ. Some of them actually get very colorful. Some of them really shift very widely out of the tube. So I'd like to say I did these, but I hired my assistant to do these because I used to do them really casually. They're kind of just smeared on. I'm like, oh, I have these tester panels that I had chopped off from other panels, and I was like, oh, I want to see how this compares to my old one or how this compares, and it was just, super random. So I just wanted to do something a little bit more organized. And what actually I find is really interesting about this as well is this was the panel I did for browns. And look at how similar a lot of these kind of look out of the tube, and then look at how different they look when we're looking at them glazed versus mixed with white. Really big difference. And the same thing with blacks. All the blacks out of the tube, because they're so dark, it's really hard to really see their personalities. Glazing and mixing with white really illuminate properties. Okay, any questions about that?
So that panel, it comes prepared.
It's got this nice sticker on it, which is very satisfying when you peel it off. Yeah, so it has this sticker. It's hard to see, but it has like the sticker on it. So this is open. This is just like a piece of foam core that I think they've treated. But this area, I've cut this and peeled the sticker off. And that's where you can, it's just nice to be able to see them. They're so satisfying, honestly, just to like peel the sticker off. I'd recommend it just for doing that alone. But this is also nice for those of you who are studying with us. Like I said, we're doing actually this. So people who are studying with us, you do have to do a value scale. So when you buy these, they do come in like a pack of 20, but they're actually useful for a lot of different things, not just color charts, but if you're doing, the first is grisaille. We're going to talk about how to work in grisaille, how to mix our grisaille. But if you wanted to create your value scale, because up until now we've had to do a drawing value scale for charcoal, or for graphite, a charcoal value scale for cast, and when we get to painting, you're going to need to do a paint value scale. So what you could do is do 9, this is already kind of laid out for you, your 9 squares of paint on here, where it's like your 1 to 9 of values. And you're going to do it the same way. Your 1, your 9, your 5, then your 7 and 3, and then 2, 4, 6, 8. I know that seems like totally different language for the rest of you, but when we do value scales, we do them in blocks of 9, and it's a way to test our mediums, or to test our what we're using, graphite, what our capabilities are, our lightest lights and darkest dark capabilities, and how to execute the values in between mechanically with our tools and things like that. So not only would this be good for grisaille for doing your value scale, because it's already laid out, But I would recommend doing it for our second cast painting, which is limited palette. That means you have 3 colors and white. You have cad red, you have yellow ochre, ivory black, and white. That's a red, a yellow, a blue, and a white. So you could say, if this is my red and this is my blue, what does it look like mixed together? And also, what does it look like when you add white? So that's called kind of doing a value string. So this is an example. So Tim was doing these limited palette. Now this is way above and beyond, but I think it's a good example. So we have a red and a yellow and a blue for our limited palette, and he decided to take the cad red and the yellow ochre and then mix them a little bit more yellow. And then he began by mixing it with like a neutral string, just to see, like, this is the amount of capabilities that are possible with, this is a black, this is a red, and this is a yellow. And you have a rainbow of opportunities for color and chroma in there. So it's just a way to test out in advance before you get to this big elaborate project that you've spent a bunch of time on your drawing and you're like, you want it to be perfect. This is just a way for you to get used to, how are my paints going to act, right? So how strong, you can see here, cad red is really strong. You can see how much it really had an impact, and we probably could have used maybe more yellow ochre in a couple of these, just because, like, it's just so strong, right? And then you can also see, like, with the yellows mixing with black, you can get these lovely greens with a yellow ochre and a black. So we have these beautiful greens and yellows in here, and you really start to see, like, wow, that's almost like a full spectrum. And this is a great palette for flesh tones, by the way, a limited palette. So these color charts are great for doing testings, not only testing your tubed paints and how they're going to act, but also testing how those two paints are going to interact with each other and how those mixtures are also going to interact with white. Make sense? So those are part of one of the exercises that are listed at the end that I would recommend for really getting to know what your materials are going to do. These are, like, in my opinion, a lot of fun to do. They don't take a ton of time, but they are really valuable in terms of familiarity with what's going to happen. Like a lot of cause and effect. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, recommendations for starting out. If you're looking to just start here at the program, I'll go into that, but also if you're just looking to start oil painting in general, a recommended palette to start with that covers a lot of color space. So for our students, when you are approaching grisaille, you're only going to need 3 colors, and that is white, ivory black, which is a blue, and raw umber, which is kind of a greeny yellow. Now those 3 mixed together will give you a neutral value. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is working in value only in our first assignment. So you don't have to worry about any other colors than those 3 paints, and we will talk later about how to mix the neutral, but those are the only 3 paints you will need to start with us. Okay. If you are going into limited palette, this is called the Zorn palette. I think there's a new name, like the Apelles palette or something, because Zorn actually used more colors than this, but it's kind of widely known as the Zorn palette, which is the white, yellow ochre, cad red, and ivory black. Now, cad red is very colorful. It's super bright, right? Bright as in chromatic. Yellow ochre is kind of like a middle value, middle chroma, and ivory black is like a low chroma, dark blue. Now, why is this great for a flesh palette? It's because you've got lots of oranges available to you, and then the black allows you to deal with chroma. You can actually gray things down, create blues. And it's a really great limited palette for if you're doing quick portraits. Okay, so those 3 paints are also your limited palette for cast painting. The cast painting, you're painting a white object. That's a white object. Now that's a full palette. Do we have a limited palette here? That might be limited palette. So that whole painting was done with the arm was done with just those 3 paints. And you're going to find that those 3 paints interacting will create a nice spectrum of color. You are going to have limitations, like you're not going to be able to do a high chroma purple with it, because your blue and your red is very colorful, but your blue is very dark and very gray. Okay, so you're not going to get neon purples out of it. But with flesh tone, you don't really need to for natural flesh tone. And it's a pretty good flesh tone. It's a pretty good range for all values of skin. So African American skin up to really pale skin, because we also have white. Okay. That's the Zoran palette, our ARA Boston limited palette. For those of you who are moving into grisaille, I would still recommend getting the limited palette too, just so you can start doing some color charts with them, that type of thing. For a full palette, this is the palette that I learned on. It's also the palette I still continue to use. These are the paints I put out every single day, no matter what I'm painting. I don't like to limit what's on my palette, but it's only 9 paints. So these are the 9 paints that this is 8, but my standard palette is right next to it. It's just one additional color. So we've got cad yellow, yellow ochre, and raw umber. Those are our yellows. We have a colorful one, a mid chroma one, and then a brownie dim one. Okay. Then we have cad red light, alizarin crimson, and burnt umber. These are my reds. Where's my thing? This is that full palette I'm talking about. So this is my cad yellow, yellow ochre, raw umber. These are my yellows. Then I have cad red light, alizarin crimson, and burnt umber. These are my reds. And then I have cobalt, or ignore this one for now. This is like my color. But our traditional palette is ultramarine blue and ivory black. So these are our blues. So I have a light, medium, dark yellow, a light, medium, dark red, and right now just 2 dark blues, but they work fine. High color, or high chroma, low chroma, high chroma, low chroma, high chroma, mid chroma, low chroma. Make sense? Warm, cool, warm, cool, warm, cool. Okay. If you took out the blacks and browns, you'd actually have an impressionistic palette. So this is a very versatile palette because you can actually reach a lot of color space. When I talk about color, it's actually a 3-dimensional space. This covers a lot of it. If there are limitations to it. If I want a high chroma purple, the problem with this palette is like very intense high chromatic purples. The most colorful purple I can get are these 2 together, and it's very dark, and then I have to dump a bunch of white in it. So there may be times that I'm working on a specific painting that I bring in a special guest. So this is what I call my starting lineup. And then what you may find that in our program, you won't need to. You're usually not working on anything that's like obnoxiously high chroma. But if you do want to start reaching out into color space, into the higher chroma areas, that's where you start going to the store and saying, ooh, that looks nice. And if it's really high chroma, it's probably just a single pigment. So that would be like your dioxazine purple. This would be like your quinacridone roses. Like these are like really intense colors. They're beautiful, but they're not always necessary. They're kind of a little over the top for some things. So our question.
Sorry,
No.
are these all opaque?
So if you take a look at my alizarin crimson, this is kind of see-through. Alizarin crimson is real. So I'll just go through really quickly about the transparency of them. Cadmiums are very opaque. So if you see cadmium in the name, it's probably very opaque. So that covers really well, and you may need to scrub extra or add a little oil to get them thinner. Raw umber is semi-opaque. I would say raw umber actually has a little bit of, it feels oilier, it feels a little more see-through. It's harder to get it to just like plop down and stay. So that one I would say is semi-opaque. Yellow ochre is mostly opaque, cad very opaque, alizarin very transparent. That one's annoying to work with. Burnt umber, opaque. Ultramarine blue, kind of transparent. I call it like the alizarin crimson of blues. So it's transparent, but it's not as transparent as alizarin. Ivory black is pretty much opaque. It's little transparent, but it's mostly opaque. Question?
When you talk about the opacity and even the personality,
Yeah.
Is that pigment based? In other words, when you're saying this, it sounds like it's the same in watercolor.
Yeah.
And so, like, if there's a bully paint in watercolor, it would also
Probably.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the property of the paint itself. So alizarin is a pigment that needs more oil to be dissolved in. So it's naturally going to be more transparent. I could be wrong on that.
No, you're correct.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew. My understanding is that it is a pigment that just needs more oil to become oil paint. If you ever watch somebody try to mull ultramarine blue, it's like pasty and grainy and gross, and then all of a sudden, with just like one extra drop of oil, it like becomes paint. It's very fascinating to watch. But it just needs, there's a certain amount of pigment or a certain amount of oil needed for different pigments. Like it's just dissolving in a way. And some of them just need more oil, and that would be like alizarin. Okay. All right, so the standard full palette that you're going to need for cast painting is, ignore the cobalt turquoise. It'd be a cad yellow, like a high chroma yellow. Yellow ochre is a fabulous color. It's very versatile. Raw umber is a nice earthy yellow, dark, sometimes greenish. An orangey red, alizarin crimson is very chromatic, but also dark. Burnt umber is very versatile. Burnt umber tends to be what we tone a lot of things with. It's a very fast drying paint. Drying time's another variable that you'll start to get familiar with. Burnt umber dries fast. It's nice, earthy, warm. That's what this is toned with down here. And then ultramarine blue and ivory black. So that's our standard full palette. Now again, every time you go to paint, you're gonna have all of these paints out, except if you're in grisaille, you're just doing values, limited palette, you're just having those 3 paints out. But when I paint at home, or when I was even, painting while I was training here, these paints always out. Because just because you're painting a red object doesn't mean you only need reds. Maybe you want to make that red a little bit more orangey, you're going to need yellows. You want to make that red a little bit more purpley and lower chroma, maybe you need an ivory black. That's a blue to mix into those reds, right? So have them all out, have your tools always available to you. Okay, so that is the standard palette. And then my personal palette, the only addition is actually this cobalt turquoise, cobalt bright turquoise from Vasari. This is liquid gold, and it costs about the same. But this is the thing that I have added to the palette since I found that I was always looking for a light blue. And so I went to the store and I found this color, and I love it because it also is a greeny blue instead of being a purpley blue like ultramarine. So again, I'm giving myself lots of possibilities in the blues and not just dark or black. Okay? Okay, so any questions about those palettes? So this is my recommendation. I know through experience, this palette covers a lot of things. If you like to do more experimenting or like high chroma, or you're not working only naturalistically at first and you want to have other colors, just what I would say recommend for this palette is like take versions of this and just amp up the chroma. So instead of alizarin crimson, you could use quinacridone rose. It's a much higher chroma pink. It's also similarly transparent. It's lighter out of the tube, but it's like more neon pink, right? So you can like take this and just notice that it's like reds, yellows, blues, and there's a variety within each one. So you basically have opened up color space in the capabilities. Okay, and then we talked about those whites. This is kind of my chart where I'm comparing those whites. Do some tests with whites. If we have time today, I'll do a little example of color mixing with one versus the other. I prefer lead white. It's very fast drying. Titanium white is a slow dryer. It's also a bully, but it does cover really well. Pros and cons. Any questions about white, Doreen?
You had a description on your strong paint film.
Yes.
What you mean by that?
Strong paint film means that when it's flexible, it'll stay together. That binder will stay together. If there's any flex to the canvas and it's not a strong paint film, it'll break. It'll be brittle. Okay, so zinc is very brittle. If you use too much solvent in something, sometimes it can make the paint film brittle. We want our paints to be like, our paint films to be kind of flexible. And that's where like the different oils, I don't know if I talk about different oils in here, do I? Yes, I do. We'll get to that. So we'll talk about the flexibility of the paint film there. But that's really something that we'll talk about in a minute. But that's the difference between, they're both lead and titanium. They're both metals. They're both very good, strong, flexible paint films.
Julie, where do you buy paints?
Anywhere. I mean, some places I can't buy all the brands I like through one place, so I'll buy my Vasari from Vasari. I'll buy natural pigments from natural pigments, and I'll buy, oh, sorry, I'm like, tired.
So
Whoa. I'll buy natural pigments from natural pigments, but Michael Harding, Holbein, Winsor Newton, you can all buy from like Jerry's or Dick Blick. Yes.
what's the manufacturer of the lead white?
So lead white, the ones I would recommend for lead white are Old Holland. Old Holland, it's going to be very expensive, but it's also the highest pigment load. Again, you're paying for what you're getting. So Old Holland lead white. I would also recommend Michael Harding's lead white, and I'd also recommend Natural Pigments lead white. Now, Natural Pigments has 1, 2, and 3. 1 is made with linseed oil. Number 2 is made with walnut oil. Number 3 is made with safflower oil, and we'll get into those properties in the next section. Okay. And did any other?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's a fork in the road where you're like the titanium path or the lead white path.
Yeah, you got to pick which team you're on.
Is it recommended to, like make a choice early? Or
Yes. Okay, so the question was like, there's obviously a split in the road on if you're using lead or titanium. Does it help to figure that out early? And I say yes. And if you want to do some tests ahead of time, sometimes I find that doing value studies of anything, it could just be a picture you have, or you just want to give yourself a small, digestible way to experiment in which you like to use better. So I feel like the big trade-off with the big trade-off with lead white is the transparency. So when you're doing a color study or a value study, you got to glob it on to get full coverage. When I paint in layers anyway, so I just know I'm going to build up to those brights. Or I start with a lighter toned canvas. With titanium, I use titanium when I do landscape painting or alla prima because I want it to cover in one day. I'm not coming back to this painting. So I use the more opaque paint when I do alla prima or landscape painting, and that's because I need that coverage. I don't want to be fighting globbing lead paint on, right? So the process determines which white I use. So for our layered paint, I also like lead white because you get a little bit of a better a better sense of value control, because the lead white isn't so overpowering that it can, if you work in a contaminated brush and you have any titanium white in there and you're working in shadows, you all of a sudden, I'm going to come over and just say everything needs to go darker, which I already do, but I'm going to say it more. So you just have to I'd say pick one and just start getting used to it. I like lead, I'm a big fan, but I know not everybody loves to use it. It's a little bit more expensive. It's more transparent, but it's very fast drying. And if you're working on stuff day to day or close to day to day, you're going to want a faster drying white anyways, because that's mostly what you put into other paints as well. Okay, so you got to pick which team you're on to start with in our program. But I do think knowing both. So when I critique people, if you're doing cast painting with us, and I come over and I'm seeing some value issues, I always say, and I'm going to maybe do some demoing for you or play around with your color mixtures. I'm going to say, what white are you using? Because I need to literally recalibrate on the fly how much I'm going to add to something else, how much white I'm going to add to those things. Okay, make sense? Questions? Okay, great. And don't use zinc if you can. If you have a bunch of zinc, you can just keep using it if you're just learning, but eventually you're gonna want the titanium or lead is the most archival for long term, but when you're just learning, it doesn't matter. Like now I care as long as my paintings last until I'm dead, but like when you're just learning, don't get too precious about that type of stuff. Okay. Then let's move on to brushes. So brushes are actually, this is a pretty good example of, this is alla prima, me having to glob things on to get full statements. But when you're layering, you have the ability to be much thinner and you can get to a much more refined result. So trying to get to this in one layer is impossible unless you're a magician. So this is where if you're looking to get more sensitive work, more subtle work, if you're really focused on getting better transitions and softer edges and atmosphere and control, this is control, but it's also a process. You have to do this, let it dry, then do this. This is globbing it on. And that's where, if I'm doing alla prima, that's an issue with lead white because it's so transparent. Okay, does that make sense? So this isn't bad. But if you're looking for a lot of these sensitivities and the subtles and the details and those, having control, if you want control at all times, 2 thinner layers is easier to control than 1 thick layer. Okay? So in terms of application and brushes, there are a bunch of different options for brushes. Actually, let me just go back a little bit. So those of you who are at ARA Boston, you are going to have to do that value scale. You don't have to get those color frontier things. You could just get a paint stick or a piece of canvas and just making your value steps. Somebody drilled holes through this because they thought they were going to maybe see what value it is, but that doesn't work because if I look at it like this versus look at it like this, it changes. So don't do this. Just make the strips. See what your capabilities are. And this is going to tell you this is how dark I can get and this is how light I can get with my paints, which is a bigger value range than you've been working at so far to this point in charcoal and pencil. Okay? And then we talked about drying time. Let's say you put all this paint out at the beginning of the day and you're like, oh shoot, I got to go, or it's the end of the day, and you're going to find that some of your paints have started to dry. Your burnt umbers, your earth tones will have already dried. However, if you have titanium white or an alizarin, very oily, slow drying, right? So I don't want to waste this paint. So what I do is I have, if you get one, these are stay wet. You can also just get Tupperware, okay? So I actually have a paper palette, like the paper palette in here cut up, and just what I do, you can see I did this at some point. I take the paint that's still wet and still usable for tomorrow, put it in here, close it off to the oxygen. Added bonus, you could also put a little sponge with some clove oil in it that'll monopolize the oxygen, slow the drying. It'll take all the oxygen and not let the other paints dry. And then put this in the freezer, okay? Because that oil paint dries from a chemical process, the addition of heat is going to speed up the process. So you can put it in your car in the summer and that paint will dry super fast. Don't put it in the oven. I think that's a good idea. Put it in a window. Or if you want the paint to slow, you're going to find your paintings in the winter dry slower. So if I want this paint to save from day to day, I'll take the paints that are still tacky. It's still wet, not tacky. Tacky's already started to dry. This can go in the freezer. And that'll make the paint stay fresh until tomorrow. Some paints will last a week. Some will last a day or 2. It's really up to the pigment itself. Okay? All right, now on to brushes and palette knives. I'm a big fan of pretty normal, average size palette knives. I don't like the massive ones, and I don't like the tiny, tiny ones. When you're mixing, you're gonna wanna mix up like a nice pile of paint. So you want something that's gonna do that efficiently. So this is my preferred size and shape of a palette knife. Some are a little bit smaller, some are a little bit bigger. This is my recommendation. Painting materials are very personal. So if you already have something you like and are used to that kind of action of mixing, that's totally fine. But I'm just, for people who don't have any supplies right now, this is kind of like my general size and shape that I prefer. It's the Creative Mark T7. It's not expensive. It doesn't come from Japan. It's like just cheap and readily available. So I bought like 100 of these at some point because if they ever stop making them, I'll be really sad. So this is my preferred size and shape of palette knife. Totally personal though. I recommend, this is like a paint eraser. This is a wipeout tool. You can get them from, Trekell has the wipeout tools. This is a Kemper wipeout tool, but they're these really cool paint shapers almost. And the nice thing about the paint staying wet on the canvas is once it's down, it's not permanent like acrylic and watercolor will dry, right? Or, it's very hard to lift it back up if it's like already fully dry. So the nice thing about oil paint is it stays wet pretty much the whole time you're working on it. It's a pro and it's also a con because it's easy to get muddy, messy, gross looking paint. So this, I actually like to use this almost like an eraser. If I don't like what I did, I'll actually use the squeegee side to kind of scrape off what I did and go back to the previous layer. Or if I need to like carve or do textures or things like that, the more pointed rubber end is nice for that too. I really like to have these, and actually another student here introduced me to them, and they're really, really versatile. So I would recommend, if you're getting into painting with us, is getting one of these as well. In terms of brushes, when you start with us here and we're painting opaquely, there's a couple different brushes that I would recommend having. And what you can see here is different brushes make different marks, and what you add to your paint is going to cause it to act differently. So actually that doesn't show the brushes, never mind. Okay, here, this is a little bit better to see. So this was, we'll talk about surfaces in a minute, but this is an example of the different marks that different things will make. So if you look at these panels, I was trying to find a new surface, and I was testing it out with a thin application with palette knife, a thin application with one of my soft brushes, and a thin application with a bristle brush. Okay, so the difference here is the bristle brushes versus, this is like a, we're going to talk about the resistance. When you load a brush and then you press into the surface, the resistance, the aggressiveness of those hairs is going to determine how it puts the paint down. So if I have a very, very soft brush, it's going to give more. It's really weak. It's a low aggression brush. It's soft. And I would say, like, I always like test it on my face to see how soft it is, because you're very sensitive here. So you're going to be able to feel like a hog bristle, scratch, scratch, scratch. A soft brush is like, oh, it's so nice. So you're looking for how aggressive it is will determine how it puts the paint down, or if it'll dig into the paint rather than laying it down evenly. So bristles will lay it down unevenly. It has a scratchier mark. A soft brush is going to be a more evenly distributed mark making and a more even distribution. And it's going to lay the paint down rather than kind of scraping through it if it's, just used by itself. Does that make sense? So I just wanted to, so I can pass these around. I just want you guys to get a feel for the difference. Now, my preferred brush for a first layer of paint is hog bristle, filbert, long filbert hog bristles. And the reason for that is because I have a lot of the same tendencies as the students here, which is we tend to be perfectionists, and she knows. We tend to be perfectionists, and we want things to look perfect right away, which is not the way we do things here. We just don't go in for the kill. We go general to specific. And so to counteract my tendencies, I use these very inaccurate and scratchy brushes, because it forces me to stay out of those details and to retain soft edges. I can't get specific. I can't get to a finished product with these things. And I do that on purpose because of my tendencies. Okay? So my tendencies are going to, if I let myself use like these nice, I would I don't want to get into those like tiny, tiny details, because this is not the time for them. So if I gave myself these, I would. So I do this on purpose. Now, not everybody needs this. Some people would prefer, you're going to use larger brushes to start. They are fine with restraining themselves. So because I'm not always good at restraining myself, I use tools that make me do what I know I should be doing. Okay, so that first layer, I tend to like more bristle brushes, a little bit more assertiveness. So I'm going to hand out, if you guys want to so these are different shapes. A bright is going to be a shorter, this is a flat because the hairs are long. The brights are just shorter than flats. So brights are still square at the end. Flats are longer, but they're still square at the end. Filberts are kind of those half moon shapes. So filberts are those rounded shapes. And then, so this, what you'll feel I'll hand this out with the other. So, here's a perfect example I'll send around. So this is a natural hog bristle. If you care about animal safety, I'm sorry, but I do like these. I'm willing to sacrifice it. And so this is a synthetic bristle, but I want you to feel that they're similar in resistance compared to the soft. All right, so feel what it feels like when you're pressing against them. You can feel them on your face. These are clean, but they're very different resistance levels. I know, that's okay. And then, these are cheap makeup brushes. I love these brushes for softening. You can really swipe at something and the paint's not going to move. If I swiped at wet paint with this, it's going to move, and it's going to move consistently. If I swipe paint with this, it's going to start scraping through it, and this is really going to scrape through it but be scratchy looking. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'll hand these around and you can see that the difference in the hairs is going to be the resistance level. So how hard you press on things is going to change, is going to be, different, how determine differences in which brushes you're going to want for different layers. Okay, if you want to pass those around. So those are the resistance levels. Personally, my preference is when we're doing color studies, which everybody has to do a color study for their grisaille cast. This is an example of a color study. This is also an example of a color study. So this is an example of a cast color study. Very simple, very blocky. This one's very organic. I tend to work much more geometric. I don't care how it's or I don't care like technically how it's simplified, as long as it's simplified to be general. This is a cast value color study. This is a limited palette color study. So, and it's very dusty. But so this is a limited palette color study. And you can, Garrett hasn't finished it, but you can see how simplified it is, but it does kind of talk about the general value structure that he's going to need for that cast, for the larger cast painting. But this is done totally opaquely, and this is done with a soft brush. Each statement is even. There's no variation of value or color within each block or statement. This is also another example in color, where each thing is kind of stated specifically. This is where we're exploring it, and when we go to do our cast paintings and color and value studies, we'll demo and all that type of stuff. But for now, when we're working opaquely and we're thinking about brushes for something like this, I'm going for those the softer, even application. So this is a Trekell Golden Tacklon. It's kind of the cheaper end, but you can find really cheap, these were probably like $2. This would also work fine. These are soft brushes in here, okay? So I'm just looking for something that's gonna evenly put a statement down. I don't want variation of opacity in there, and those hog bristles are gonna scratch through and make it an uneven statement. Does that make sense? Okay, so those, for a color study or value study, soft. For our second layer of paint, softs. Our third layer of paint, softs. Me personally, the first layer of paint, I really like those hog bristles because of my tendencies, and it really allows us to stay simple, focus on the drawing, have soft edges, and not have a ton of buildup of paint on the first layer, because I'm kind of doing more scrubby action. Okay, any questions about brushes? They don't have to be expensive. You're gonna have to feel out which brands you like, what shapes you like. I really like the flats in the brights, because, or mostly the brights, they give me control, but I can draw with them too, and I can think planerly, and I can think structurally. Whereas Garrett hates brights. I don't know how he uses filberts, and he doesn't know how I use flats. But with the first layer, I like the filberts because that little rounded tip doesn't let me get so specific, right? So those filberts are nice for me for staying general. He can't, and you can see here, his mark making is very much more organic than mine. I'm much more geometric, and he likes those filberts. So those rounded tips.
How come watercolor brushes are short and our brushes are long?
I believe there are longer watercolor brushes because you're wanting them to hold more volume of liquid. But there are some watercolor brushes that are really nice for oil painting because they hold a larger load. I've seen some pretty long watercolor brushes. It's not a dumb question though. There is no dumb question. Okay. Brushes, hairs. So those of you who are within our program and we need to soften edges or knock down any texture, that makeup brush, we have a link for that. It's fabulous for softening edges and like just knocking down texture. They're very low resistance, and you can get some really cool effects by like putting paint down, really softening it. It almost makes it like it's blurry and out of focus without making it smeary. It's really nice. Okay, surfaces. I'm not going to go too in-depth in surfaces because there's a lot of options. But if you want some recommendations for starting, I would recommend in general using a rigid surface. I'm not a big fan of stretched canvases because they are not fabulously archival. So they're easy to kind of poke through, right? You can kind of poke through the canvas from the back. Heat and humidity tend to make it a little bit like this is still pretty tight. You can see it's like a drum, right? So that's a nice tension on the canvas. But in a different environment, let's say I ship this to North Carolina and it's much more humid. Well, it's pretty humid here, but you know what I'm saying. If I go to a drastically different climate, what can happen is it actually loosens up. And then it looks floppy. And actually, I think Antonio's is a little floppy over there. And that would be irritating for me, that if I go to a show where my painting's hanging and it's like floppy. The other thing I don't like about stretcher bars is stretching the stinking canvas. I hate it. It's the most irritating process. I like to just buy stuff and use it. I want something that's affordable, but I don't have the time or the space or the desire to like make any surfaces. So a lot of times people come in with pre-stretched canvases from the store and they're already floppy because they've been in the warehouse and they've been in the store. And so what do? They usually send those little wooden keys with it. And those wooden keys are supposed to go into the stretcher bars in the corners, and then you hammer them and it actually pushes the stretcher bars further apart and tightens up the canvas. So that's what those are for. I always threw them out because I had no idea what they were for. But again, I don't even want that issue, so I would recommend panels. They're more archival. You don't have to worry about your painting doing this and any cracking and things like that. So I would recommend rigid panels to paint on. There's tons of options. You could just get acrylic primed. You can paint oils on acrylic primed surfaces because acrylic is already super dry. It's evaporation, it's already dry. Painting oils on it is fine. You don't ever want to paint acrylics on an oil primed surface because what's going to happen is your oil paint is still kind of more flexible and your acrylic is less and it's going to crack. So don't put acrylic on oil. You can put oil on acrylic. So if you want to do an underpainting in acrylic, you can do that. Make sure it's on an acrylic primed surface, paint some acrylics, and then do a final layer in oil. That's totally fine and great for speed. We don't do that here. We're only doing oils here. So if you're looking to try out some different surfaces, I'll give you my recommendations. You can get tons of different panel options at any store. There's gesso board that's no canvas on it, but it's kind of slick, and you're going to find it's hard to get the paint to just sit down on it. And that's because it's like a little bit of a skating rink. It's so smooth and it just slides right over it, right? That might be something you're looking for. That's not something I love. I like a little bit of a combination of grippiness and letting the paint just kind of lay down on the surface, but I also like a little bit of texture, so I actually like a linen texture. So if after we're all done and talking, if you want to feel some of these options out, I am an ambassador for Artifacts. My favorite panel from them is called Artifacts 538, which is it's oil primed and it's linen that's been glued to ACM. ACM is aluminum composite material. It's a sign making material, but what's really nice about this is you could, let's say I buy an 11 by 14 and I decide I want my composition to be 11 by 11. I can just score it a couple times and then snap it. So I can modify the size of it super easy, and I'm not restricted to the size it is. That's a lot harder to do on a stretch canvas. And it's also harder to do if you have a wood panel or an MDF panel. So I'm a fan of this because I want to buy it, take it out of the container and use it. And I also don't want to be restricted to the size that it already is. So I also like that it has a little bit of texture to it. So if I do want to do some textural work, like maybe I want to make a rock look like a rock, or look like, use the texture to create this uneven thing, I can. It's absorbent enough that when I put paint down on it, I can make an even distribution of paint with one paint stroke, but I can also kind of scrub over the top to get that texture look. Okay. Over years and years, I learned on Raphael oil prime linen canvas. This is at Jerry's. It's relatively affordable. I learned on it. I loved it. I'm so familiar with it. And when they started to go downhill, I got really freaked out because I'm like, what am I going to paint on? I did a ton of research, and that's what all these are from. This same canvas, this Bell RT canvas, is this canvas. So I found that Artifex's 538 was literally the same Bell RT canvas that I know and love. I already am familiar with it. I prize familiarity over novelty any day. So I know what's going to happen when I paint on this. This just happens to be a lot more convenient for me. Now there's other options too, like having acrylic prime canvas. What you're going to notice here is that this is actually a lot smoother, but this is going to be grippier when you start to put the paint down, right? So it really grips the paint. You get these nice smooth distribution, but the texture is much more fine. It's much more like a, right? It's a little bit more mechanical texture, but it's less texture, okay? This is the acrylic primed canvas that's not linen. So it is acrylic gesso. I'm assuming it's gesso. It's acrylic primed, so I can paint either acrylics or oils on this. And it's a polyester blend, but again, it's on a nice rigid surface, but so I don't have to worry too much about it being on this like fabric surface, because it's going to be rigid. They also have options, not just them, but there's Artifex, there's Raymar, there's also Jerry's Artorama has like a huge variety. I would recommend getting some 5x7 sample panels of a bunch of different kinds and try doing like the same little study or the same little painting on all of them. And you're gonna find they're gonna act drastically different, and so part of your natural tendencies is going to come through and work well with one of those surfaces. Does that make sense? Okay, so if you did want to try out any Artifacts, I do have a discount code. So if you did want to try some, there's a discount code with the code Julie10. But I'd also recommend there's other ones to try out. So here, this is Raymar has oil paint paper glued down to a surface. They also have probably the smoothest linen I've seen, which is I believe they're 84C, but it's like the Rolls Royce of canvas, and the price reflects that. So it's, a little pricey. I don't know if you want to try that out right away if you're just starting. There's plenty of in-store options that you can try out, but I'd say get a couple small versions and test out how the paint acts and do a small study, a little painting of an apple on each one or something like that, just to try them out. Okay? I recommend, if you just want to get it from Jerry's, the Raphael oil prime linen. This linen tends to be stronger than cotton, but if you're on a panel, it almost doesn't matter. Okay, any questions about surfaces? And those of you, if you're doing cast painting with us, you're usually going to be doing a preliminary drawing. So you can kind of feel out what size you're going to want in advance and then order and tone your canvas in advance. But that way you don't have to be like, before you even start buying a canvas right away, you'll just want to make sure you have smaller canvases for your color studies and your value studies. Okay, so the things we add to our paints. The things that we add to our paint. So we just have, right up to this point, we have our brushes, we have our surfaces, we have what paints we're using, how to clean them, and we have our palette, I guess. Yes. So really the only thing that we have left to talk about in general about the process of painting is if you're going to add anything to the paint. And in general, recommended to not add anything. That's ideal. But sometimes our paint doesn't do what we want it to do, and that might require us to add a medium. So one of the things that, there's only 2 things that we use within our program that we recommend using, 2 things to add to your paint. One is just more oil, so more of that binder. So one is just oil. The other is a solvent. The solvent is actually, it doesn't actually break down the oils. What the solvent does is it just allows it to be spread further apart, and then that evaporates and you're left with that paint distributed over a wider surface area. That's gonna make it dry really fast. Does that make sense? Okay, so, but in my brain, I like to think, I just pretend the solvent's breaking down the oil. That's in my world. Just sometimes it's easier to understand. I would prefer for you guys to think about what's useful, not what's like technically correct. You know what I mean? So if you're adding too much solvent, and we know that if it spreads it too thin, it also kind of breaks down the oil paint. This is just made with, actually, let's do this one. This is raw umber. This is dirt from the city of Umber, and nothing has been done to it. And it's mixed with oil. And then we have burnt umber, which is dirt from the city of Umber that has been burned and then mixed with oil. Okay, so that same pigment, different chemical processes or different heat temperatures, 2 different colors. So if we start to break down or distribute that oil too far, we're gonna be left with just dirt. So that's our danger of using too much solvent, is you're just going to be left with a couple of particles here and there that aren't held together with anything. I like to think about the analogy of a stream bed with rocks in it. Okay, so if we have a bunch of rocks and our stream bed ends up down here, those rocks can easily move around. What we want to do is make sure that our stream bed stays enough to kind of hold the rocks, right? We could drown it, we could drown them, but that's like gonna be a lot of oil, a lot of yellowing, okay? So by adding solvent, you're kind of lowering the stream bed height. By adding medium, by adding a lot of medium, you're gonna add transparency and adding more see-through liquidy stuff, but it will cover those pigment particles. So when we're adding solvent, solvent is one of the things that we're going to add to our paints to make it dry a little bit faster and get it to spread further. It makes it more watery, right? So that is solvent. It's going to dry by evaporation. A little bit goes a long way. You're going to find, and I encourage you to do tests like this, where if you add a little bit of OMS, you're going to see it turns into like acting like watercolor. And it's very liquidy, and it can be hard to control, and it starts to tack up really fast. But if you go back over it, you can actually reactivate it very, very quickly, very soon. If I left this to dry overnight, it probably wouldn't pull up too much unless I thinned it out too much. The solvents are flammable, and you should try not to breathe in too much solvent. So just because odorless vanilla spirits is odorless doesn't mean that you should be having a giant container of solvent open all day. I will notice at the end of the day that my throat is sore if I accidentally left the top off my solvent for too long. So just try to be conscious about it. It doesn't mean don't use it. It just means keep it covered. It's good to have ventilation. I don't have ventilation in my studio, but I don't use a lot of solvents because I don't like the way they make the paint act, and I don't love breathing them in. So I just like, if I need to use them, I'll use a little bit, close it up, and then that'll go a long way for a while. Okay? It's literally, if you dip the tip of your brush into solvent, it's gonna loosen up that paint. If you dunk it in, it turns into a loose, uncontrollable mess. Okay? So that's really hard to control. So examples of those are turpentine, odorless mineral spirits, and terpenoid and Gamsol. Any questions about solvents? Okay, oils. So in ARA Boston painting, if we're going to add solvent at any point in time, it's going to be A, when we tone the canvas, and B, on our first layer, because that's going to make it dry faster, make it a very lean layer. Lean meaning not a lot of fat, oil. So if we're going to use solvent, it will be in that first layer, and that's it. And some people don't even need it in the first layer. Oils. So the oils, if we're going to add anything to make our paint more fluid in later layers, or if we just want to add, our paint is maybe stiff and it's gotten gunky in the tube and we just want to like loosen it up a bit, a drop or two of linseed oil. That's it. Okay. The differences in oils, these are the only, do not add vegetable oils to your paints. Do not add clove oil to your paints. Do not add non-drying oils to your paint. We need oils that will dry and oxidize. And those are going to be linseed oil. Those are going to be walnut oil and or poppy or safflower oil. Those are the only 3 oils you should be adding to your paint. Okay, don't wash your brushes in vegetable oil. Don't wash them in olive oil. Don't wash them in any oils galore. Just stick with, keep it simple, stick with linseed oil. Okay, and these are the trade-offs of these oils. Linseed oil is fast drying, but it's the most yellow, but it's also a strong paint film. Safflower on the other side is very not yellow, but also brittle and very slow drying. If you want your paints to be wet for a week or 2, that's the way to do it. But I do not want that. I want to be able to paint on top of my painting in a couple of days. Okay?
When you mix oils in the same painting, do you have to stick to the same
I
oil?
say be consistent. I'd say be consistent. Like just if you're going to use linseed oil to add to things, because you're dealing with drying times and you want to make sure things are dry before you're painting on them again, you don't want to like be wondering, what did I use? And that's the big thing about why we teach this way, is because we need to make sure that that we have repeatability. We want to know cause and effect. We want to know how we can modify our process to get the result we're looking for. And if all the variables have changed every single time, you don't know. So I'd say be consistent. And I'd say just stick with linseed oil. It's honestly the strongest paint film. It's the fastest drying. It's the most low maintenance. And the only downside is it yellows over time, but you can just put it in a window and bleach it back out again. Okay, question?
Is next day usually not an option for a layer? Next day to paint over a layer.
Okay, so the question is the next day too soon to paint on a layer? It depends. It depends on how you're painting. It depends on the pigments you're using. So if you said a lead white mixed with a burnt umber, you probably could paint it on it the next day if it's a thin layer. But if you're using an alizarin, a phthalo, an ivory black, and you're trying to paint on it the next day, absolutely not. It depends on the pigment. It depends on how thick or thin you painted, because that's going to influence drying time. But then there's also, if you use solvent, it could very well be like dry enough, so that spread the paint thin enough that it's going to dry faster. Okay, does that make sense? Question?
I'm trying to understand the relationship between the solvent and the oil. Does the solvent dissolve the oil, or I mean, pigment floats around in oil.
Yeah.
And then what does solvent do?
The solvent allows that oil to be stretched the same amount, stretched thinner over a larger surface area. So that actually thins the oil out. So think of that stream bed. So with just paint by itself, that oil is enough to cover the rocks. But when I introduce solvent, it allows the oil to actually be spread further, and that level goes down. So it's going to dry faster because that layer of oil is thinner, right? So that oil will dry faster because it has more surface area access to the oxygen and drying time. So that drying time goes down because of it, and that solvent evaporates, the linseed oil is spread further, and it takes very little time for it to oxidize. If I add oil, I'm adding additional things that need additional time to dry. So what the solvent's doing is allowing a wider surface area, which means it's going to dry faster. So solvent will make your paint dry faster.
So when you're first toning the canvas, are you using solvent?
Yes. So when I tone a canvas, and there's videos on our YouTube channel and also my YouTube channel, how to tone a canvas, I'm putting solvent down and I'm introducing a little bit of pigment and I'm distributing that pigment over the entire surface area very, very thin. And that's usually dry enough for me to paint on the next day.
But if you add too much solvent and it's thinned out, so you just, is it gonna get that chalky look?
Not even chalky. It's going to get like, it's going to look uneven. And what's going to happen, you're going to come back the next day and you could actually wipe that pigment right off the surface. Because it's just going to, there's going to be nothing holding it together. That linseed oil, the oil has just been distributed so thin, you got nothing holding those rocks down.
So you need to find the right balance of solvent and oil. Too.
Yeah. You start to see when it starts to happen. So this, like, you're getting some even distribution here, but there's gonna be times that you're gonna start to see it breaking apart. Okay. Do we need
Is that how a brittle oil would act? Is it just, it comes up really easy?
No, a brittle oil, what's gonna happen is like, it's gonna still have this rock, it's gonna still like be covering all the rocks. But the problem is like, think about, it becomes a less flexible layer. So if I have a like a rubbery pad, it can move, right? But if it's like a peanut brittle, you flex it, it's going to snap. That's a brittle layer, right? But if I have like a silicone, that's a very, like, you flex it, it's going to flex. Brittle, when you have a brittle paint layer, it's going to snap. And that's where you're going to, if you have a lot of the safflower oil is more brittle, the poppy seed is more brittle. So the paint film with linseed oil is very silicone-y, rubbery. The poppy seed, safflower oil tends to be more, okay? Does that make sense? Yeah.
So if you have student grade paint, you've got lots of oil and not enough pigment, but
It's not lots of oil, it's lots of oil and filler, which is usually marble dust.
okay.
Or, yeah, pretend it's like the raisins of, it's just like clear junk. Glass, think of it just glass shards or something in there. It's just like, it's filler. It's not actually more oil. It's
Okay.
actually like just more particles of nothingness.
So the oil's holding all
It's
this
dark matter.
pigment, but
Yeah.
pigments, I mean, all the particles, but they're not contributing to the color.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, exactly. Yep. Okay, so, and then medium. So mediums, when you use the word mediums, solvent is a medium. It's a thing you add to the paint. Oil is a medium, you add it to the paint, but you can also have mixtures of mediums. So you could add a mixture of solvent and oil to make the paint more fluid, but then the solvent will dry and then that additional oil is still left too, right? So you can, anytime you add a mixture or anything to the paint, in a way we're talking about the use of mediums. But I know, Rick, you had asked about dryers. So let's say you do want to paint on something day to day. The challenge with that is you could be rushing the process, and anytime you add anything to your paint, you've got two consequences. Number one, it gets more transparent. Any addition of anything at that time, that paint will be more transparent. Okay. It also becomes less controllable. You're adding more fluidity, more soupiness to the paint. So anytime you add something to the paint, it's going to become more see-through, more transparent, and less easy to control. Okay. It's a trade-off, and you don't necessarily need that in first layers because you're painting over anything and everything anyways. So that's why adding some like solvent or a dry to an early layer, not that big of a deal, because you're not supposed to be going for it right away anyways.
What's an example of a dryer?
An example of a dryer would be an alkyd, like so one common one that we use here is walnut alkyd medium. There's also a medium called gelkyd, which sounds a lot like walnut alkyd medium, right? So it's basically an oil that's been treated in a way that makes it super fast drying. So that's a gelkyd, gelkyd light. Gelkyd light is just gelkyd mixed with solvent. It's a fast drying medium, but just because you dump more of it in there doesn't mean it's going to dry faster, because if you add a whole bunch of medium, that medium now has to dry, right? So you're just supposed to be adding like a little bit of mediums to paints. But so a dryer would be walnut alkyd and a gelkyd. There's also liquin, There is epoxide oil. There's pale drying oil. They all are different versions of dryers. Some are metals that are added to it. So for example, I believe pale drying oil is just an oil that a lead siccative. I'm probably butchering this, but they add things to the paint that make it dry faster, and it's kind of in the right proportions for it. Okay, so they just are different versions of making whatever you add it to dry faster. Some will make it more glossy. So for example, a Gelkid will make your paint glossier and dry faster, but also more transparent because it's adding fluid to your paint. A liquid is going to add fluidity to the paint, make it dry faster, but it dries a little bit more matte. So each one has different properties. I would recommend not using dryers or crazy stuff added to your paint right away. When you're doing cast painting, what I would recommend, especially if you're like, I have to work on this day to day, what I would recommend is the first layer, you're going to use your dryer. What you're going to do in the second layer is plan ahead where you plan to work so you're not touching something that you painted the day before. So a lot of oil painting is time management in terms of, I painted on that 2 days ago and that has a lot of ivory black in it. I'm going to work this area over here. Okay, so it's a little bit of time and space management, but in my own personal work, if I'm in a rush, I might add a drop or two of dryer to my slow drying paints before I start painting. So ivory black gets a little bit, my alizarin crimson gets a drop, and my cadmium will get a drop. Everything else is a fast dryer. So the introduction of my lead white into other ones will help all of them dry faster anyways. But I'm not gonna just like pour a bunch of dryer into all of my paints. Does that make sense? Okay.
So how do all these additives affect the archival quality?
That's a good question. There's controversy in terms of adding anything you add to the paint is going to usually adjust the paint film to some degree. There are some that are better than others. So I believe epoxide oil is an oil that in Gelkid or things like that will actually help the paint films in general. So you're okay in that. Like, in general, I would recommend the walnut Elkid medium, walnut Elkid medium, yes, and or Gelkid. Those are like kind of they're cheap and they're good. So I would recommend if you're going to use a dryer, I would use. And Gelkid Light is the same thing as Gelkid. It just has solvent added to it. So just be aware that Gelkid Light is a little less honey-like because it has solvent in it. Okay. Yeah, so that's and then the fat over lean thing. Has anybody not heard of fat over lean before? I mean, if you're new to oil paint, it might not be familiar to you. Okay, so there's this term you're going to hear going around the halls called fat over lean, but I think it's more useful for you to think of it as fast drying things under slow drying things. Okay, so fat means oily, means the oil takes a long time to dry. Lean means there's less oil, so it takes less time to dry. So here, what I want you to notice is that we want, in our first layer, the thing that's going to dry the fastest. So if I'm going to add dryers, it's going to be my first layer. That's also why you can use acrylics as your first layer, because it dries super fast by evaporation. Okay, when we put a layer on top of that paint, acrylic's already dry. If I do a layer with solvent in it and it's drying really fast because it's just really thin. So my next layer just has to equal or dry slower. So I can do the same amount of solvent with paint on top of that if I wanted to. Or I could do just paint, because just paint has more oil than paint with solvent in it. Does that make sense? So the solvent allowed that oil to spread further. So it dries faster than a layer of just paint, which is just oil, like nice, dense, thick paint or oil with the pigments in it. So that's going to dry slower. I could do a layer of just paint on top of just paint on top of just paint because this paint has started to dry, and then this layer is going to dry the same speed, but this one's already started. Just paint, just paint, just paint, totally fine. You could do 1,000 layers if you want to. If I do paint with solvent, paint, paint with extra oil, good. If I do paint with oil, just paint, bad. Paint with oil, dry slower because you've added slower drying stuff. Just paint on top. This is going to start drying. So this is going to become rigid while this is still moving. And if you've ever put pudding in the fridge without a top on it, you know it, as it moves underneath, it cracks on top. So if you see stuff crack, it's because you had stuff that was not dry or slower drying under fast drying stuff. So if you do just paint and then paint with solvent, bad. Okay, so these are all just different examples of good and bad. Does that make sense? It's just drying time. It's just drying time. Here's the thing. If I did a layer of just paint and I waited a year, I could probably do a layer with paint and solvent on top of it because it's dry for a year, right? I don't have to worry about like, what did I use in this? You know, it's like a year later, it's pretty much dry unless you use safflower oil. So does that make sense? So you're just thinking like, is the previous layer dry or going to be faster drying? If I put a big thick chunk of titanium white and then I try to like put solvent with burnt umber over it, that's like your prime recipe for cracking. Does that make sense? So fat over lean just means you just want to make sure that the layer before is going to dry faster than the layer that you're putting on top of it. Okay. And then we're almost done. We're almost there. Okay. Oiling in and sinking in. So this is an oil painter's biggest pet peeve is the concept of when you're painting in oils, you are going to experience something called sinking in. And what that means is that your paint is not going to look the way that it looked when you painted it all the time, especially if you don't use any special mediums. So an example of this is I could just do this on here. So if I just look at this color of my burnt umber, straight burnt umber, I use makeup wedges for this, for oiling in. So let's say I were to go paint, I wanted to paint on this again, but I just wanted to match what I was doing or like meet up with an area that I was working before. And I mix this color and then I put it down and it looks great. And I came back or I go to varnish it, it's going to look like two different things. And here's why. This oil paint, as it dried, it became matte. It doesn't look shiny like when the paint was wet. Okay, so if you come back to your paint and you're like, oh, my darks looked so much darker yesterday, and now it looks all like gray and matte. That's because the oil is kind of sunken below some of those paint particles, and the light is scattering like on a matte surface. But you know when you get a glossy photograph, those colors are like super vivid and they're super rich. That's because we're not causing all these paint or not all those light rays aren't, going in all different directions. Instead, you've got the water line is above those paint particles, so you're just getting exactly what you're seeing. This is very good drawing here. Okay, so that's what we're doing by what I'm going to do now, and this is also what varnish does. Varnish is going to resaturate all the appearances of your color. So it's not like your paint actually changed. It's that the appearance of it changed based on the kind of what you're seeing. It's a light refraction. So I'm going to show you what that looks like when I oil it in. So if I can stress how little oil you should be using for this. Because if you use too much, you're going to get drips of oil paint by the end of the day. Drips collecting and drying, and then there's nothing you can do about those drips of oil, okay? So try to do this with the minimal amount of oil when you come to work on it, and only oil in the section you plan on working if you're going to, okay? If I do a first layer, and then I come back to it in a couple days and I'm going to paint on again, I'm covering the whole thing. I don't need to match anything yet. So there's no point in me oiling it. I don't need to do any of that because I have to put new paint on it anyways. But if I come back a couple days from that and I've done some more advanced work and I need to make sure that I'm kind of patching up next to it and I need to know exactly what I'm patching up next to, I'm just going to oil in the area that I'm patching up next to. I don't need to do the whole thing. Does that make sense? Okay.
Wait, what are you using for oil?
Just linseed oil.
Okay.
So this is just my cleaning tank. I wouldn't recommend using your cleaning tank, but I'm not going to go get special oil for this. So usually what I do when I oil in is I'm just going to take a makeup sponge and I'm going to get a little of the corner of the wet and I'm going to actually dab off some excess. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to slightly rub it over the surface. So look at the difference, what that looks like. Okay, so it's the value looks darker, the color looks richer. That's what the paint looks like, not the dry part. So what I'll do now is take the dry side and wipe off any excess and distribute it the rest across the whole area. And I want to make sure that nothing is like, I don't want it to be like a film of oil, because that oil, once it dries, will yellow over time. So I'm just trying to refresh the color so it looks the way it actually looks. So when I match this color, or I know what I'm working up against, I know what's going on. Does that make sense? Okay. If I did this every single time over the whole painting, you're going to end up with a couple things. One, drips of oil. And two, there's going to be a point at which the surface doesn't want to like take any more oil, and you're going to end up with like Windex on your windshield where nothing's going to sit because nothing can grab because it's all slick with that shiny oil. Does that make sense? Okay. If you did it over the whole, let's say hypothetically, you had a whole painting and every single time you came to paint, you oiled the whole thing in and then painted over the whole thing again, you'd be fine. Because that oil, now that I'm going to paint on this, gets put into the paint that goes into it. Now you've just got like a paint layer with like a little bit of extra oil added. Does that make sense? Okay.
That doesn't lift the paint.
It should be dry. I could put solvent on this and it shouldn't pull up. Because that's like your oil paint layer, once it's oxidized, is like, it's pretty strong. Like you've seen conservators, they're like removing varnishes. Like it's creating like a literal net, like a net of bonds between the layers. The oil paint, it's fabulous. It's strong. That's why we paint our houses with it, right? It's like, it resists water. It's great. So once it's dry, it shouldn't pull up. But I can resaturate it with, I just want to make sure that I take that dry side and really make sure all that oil is just kind of sitting on the surface, but like as little as possible. Okay? Any questions about that?
And then you throw that makeup sponge away, or do you?
Into the oily waste bin. Into the oily waste bin. Yeah. I mean, I'll use this. If it's not really gross, I'll maybe use it a couple more times, but I usually don't save it too much, but I just want to make sure I'm not putting buckets of oil on the surface. So that's something that's unique. I mean, with acrylics, you may find that you can still varnish acrylics and it'll kind of refresh the color. But the difference between oils and acrylics is I feel like you get this, a little bit more of this like kind of luscious paint film look to oils. It just looks more luminous because of the way the light can kind of bounce around within the oil layers is really nice. And the acrylics don't always get that same quality. And I do think that, you're just trying to be conscious about not dumping a bunch of oil into this because that's going to make it not so great. Okay, and this is exactly what varnish does. So when you're done, let's say you're done with your painting, you've let it dry for as long as you possibly can. This is what varnish does. It creates a protective layer at the end. It's a resin distributed in solvent, and you want to make sure everything's totally dry because again, you're putting in a way solvent over the whole painting. That's what that final varnish layer does. So if it looks weird now, but when you painted it, it looks right, you can have confidence that when you go to varnish, it should again look exactly the way it was when you painted it. Okay, and if you're here and you're like, I'm scared about varnishing, we can do this together. Okay, because varnishing can get really stressful. I like to use the synthetic varnishes. I would recommend like Gamvar or Natural Pigments, Conservar, Regal Res. They're synthetic, they're easy to remove, and they're easy to apply. So I would recommend those two. You can get into more fancier varnishes, but they are you have to wait longer for them to dry, and I just am not a fan. Okay, so I'm going to go over exercises that I would recommend that you guys do to really feel things out You can do this while you're painting, before you start painting in oils. If you've been experimenting, you may find that these are really useful for finding out the aha reasons why certain things are happening. So the first one is those color charts, is making sure you just know what your paint's personalities are. Like each of them, you know, they have their own little personalities, and like some of them are really irritating, but they do their job, and other ones are, you know, make your life easier, but you have to know what they're going to do. So those would be the color chart exercises that I think would be a really good way to just get off on the right foot with a new palette, or with a standard palette in general, more consistent palette. The layering test. So everything we've talked about up until now is opaque, right? We talked about opaque, opaque, opaque. Master opaque. If you learn how to paint opaque, you're in the clear. All of our color studies are opaque. All of our value studies are opaque. If you can master opaque painting, you are going to be solid for everything else, because it gives you a reliable, repeatable process to come back to every single time. Now, when we start working into still life painting here at the school, we're going to start working in transparencies as well. We're going to start introducing additional challenges and maximizing the use of oil paint, which is using transparency. So our first assignment we talked about earlier was glazing the red fabric, right? So what we can start to do is test out what are the possibilities of our paints in working in transparencies, and what happens when we layer different things on top of each other. And this whole exercise right here is only done with 2 paints, burnt umber and white, and that is it. But I want you to notice how many colors and values are possible with just 2 paints, and you're just layering in different orders. And this is using transparency. Okay, so the first layer, this is just burnt umber, stretched thinner all the way across. So this is totally opaque, more transparent. And you can see that on the white surface, this gets that nice rich red, this nice glowing dark, lovely reddish brown, just taking burnt umber opaque to transparent. So that's just 1 layer. Okay. What I have for these 2 lower layers is just burnt umber mixed with white. So notice the color differences between burnt umber when it's mixed with white versus just thinned out. So we talked about a little bit on the color charts. If I take that burnt umber and white mixture and thin it out, you're going to notice that you start to see some of those reds again. It's not as intense as here, but you know, transparently, the mixture, that brown, starts to reveal some of that warmth again. Okay, this layer started out, this is just 2 layers, totally brown. Didn't do anything, just burnt umber all the way across. Then I took white and I did white fully opaque to transparent. Look at how blue-gray this looks. So when we take a light value and thinly scrub it over a dark value, it shifts in hue. It shifts the color temperature. So we've got these very bluey, cool notes. It's just white, thinly, transparently put on brown. Okay? If I took a cad yellow and did the same thing, this would not be cad yellow, this would look green. Because the yellow is having an influence, but the brown underneath, it's actually like affecting the appearance of the paint. So you start to see you have these really dramatic shifts in expectation of what's going to happen. Because like, oh, I'm putting yellow on this, it's going to look yellow. But if you put it too thin, it's actually going to look green. And that's because what's underneath it affects how it looks.
So would you turn it red, where umber is more of a red?
So you got the burnt umber as a red, but look at but if you see how dark it is, that red really isn't saying anything.
Okay.
But so to that point, right below it is this. It's my burnt umber. It's that nice rich red that we had from above, right? And I put that all the way down here, let it dry. Then I put white on top of it. So that cool white mixed with that light red has a purple feel. That's a complex way of making a purple rather than mixing it directly. So I'm using the fact that I take a lighter paint and put it over a darker color, I know it's going to shift it cooler. It's going to shift it grayer, but it's also combining with that the red I can see through it. So you're actually seeing both the red and the blue, and it's making a kind of complex violet. Whereas if I just mix those together, it would not look like that. So when you're in a museum and you can actually go up close to a painting, you can start to see that looks fully opaque. They mixed that color. Or do I see kind of both red and blue happening at the same time? They glazed to get that appearance. Okay, so that's a complex way of making a color rather than a direct way of making the color. It's almost like taking the scenic route, but the scenic route is unreliable. If I tried to get this exact thing again, it's impossible. I could not match it up so it looks seamless because I'm doing it in a complex way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'd have to redo the whole thing again.
So would you choose that technique, for instance, for flesh tones because it has that more?
Some people
perhaps more
do.
subtlety?
Yes, some people do. So here, this is actually a pretty decent example. So here, when I was painting John, this whole painting was painted blue first. The whole painting, it was toned blue. And my intention was to leave some of that blue peeking through in some of these areas for the veins, and allow for that to kind of drive that kind of, it starts to look a little gray, which is what I wanted, but I allowed, so if I took the lighter warms over the darker blue, it's gonna have that effect, right? And so translucent skin tones, you'll see a lot of people will do verdaccios where they paint the skin green first and then they do flesh tones on top of it. It's because they're trying to get some of the green might peek through. But you'll also find in much more classical paintings where people will take the dark hair and actually have the hairline go into the forehead and then let that dry, and then they'll scrub the flesh tone thinly over that extended hairline, and you get those grays and blues where on the eyebrows you tend to get these grays and blues where you can see both skin and hair, right? So it's kind of using the layering effect. You have to think ahead a couple steps. It's much harder to control. It's impossible to repeat exactly every time. It's not always repeatable. And with transparency, think about what happens if I have a line and I want to move it and I have transparency. I'm going to still see that previous line, right? So it's very unreliable. It's hard to make adjustments in drawing. It's hard to make, you just need opacity to make adjustments in drawing. And it's a little bit more unreliable. It's beautiful when it's done right. And it can give you some beautiful, amazing, complex colors. But it is a much more advanced way of working, okay? It's hard. So if you want to build a good structural process, learn the opaque first, and then we'll move into working more transparently. But this is a way you can start to get to know these. So this is just brown, all pure dark brown, and then I scrub after it's dry, make sure it's dry, just white as a gradient, thick to thin, and you'll see how blue this can look. Okay.
All these layering are done using solvent or without solvent?
No solvent, just paint. If you're doing this, it actually helps to have it oiled in a little bit because that oil will kind of help the transparency. And then this is, again, just brown first, and then it's a brown and white mixture, opaque to transparent. So this is where you're starting to see some of those greens come out.
Is that your little?
The next one, because this one is just thin brown with a little bit of white scrubbed on top. I just wanted you to see the purplies that you can get, but you have to make sure. I'm like, oh, I'm going to go red first, and then I'm going to scrub white on top of it. So you're kind of sacrificing value first, and you're going darker than you think because you know you're going to scrub white on top, and that's going to lighten it, but it'll also make it more purple. Much more complex. Does that make sense? Okay. Again, this isn't for program people. This is coming. You don't need to do this right now. But for anybody who wants to explore this early or just wants to try it out, this is a great way to try that out. This last one is 3 layers. This is this layer. I already did this down here, and then I went back and glazed brown over it again. So I can get back some of that chroma. I can get, if I take some of these dark purples and I glaze some of the brown back over, I get a different hue. Okay, so there's a lot of possibilities. This is just, you're not trying to hit a target. I just want you to experience what happens. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's another exercise that you can do. These ones are super beneficial. That's another lovely exercise to do, especially for those. This is also an assignment that we have here at the school, that if you are doing the, we call it the extended dry brush figure painting. That means you are only using burnt umber and white for the whole figure painting, and the whole assignment is doing this with a figure painting. And it's the most irritating, hard assignment at this program, other than the red cloth and white shiny object.
But the results are beautiful.
They're not. If you want to see more, there's examples in the figure room of these assignments, and there's a big variety. Okay, and then the last exercise. This is mostly for our ARA Boston students here. Is mixing the neutral, and this is something that we can also walk through with you in class in person. But mixing the neutral, this is mostly for our ARA Boston students. We have people work in grisaille for their first painting. So that means it's just a neutral value in white and a string of values in between. So the question is, how do you mix the neutral value? How do you get to a neutral value? So the challenge with that is when your paints are this dark, it's hard to see what their true nature is, right, when they're out of the tube. So what we're going to have to do is create a situation in which we find our neutral. So I guess I'll do that in person so you guys can see it. What I would recommend, there's a couple options for students. You can mix your neutral every time you paint, or you could mix a whole bunch of a neutral and tube it. So that's a little bit more efficient, but it also requires you to do some work in advance. So you can tube premixes if it's helpful, and your neutral might be one of those. I went through the program and mixed it every time because I, don't learn very quickly. But I just want to show you like a pretty quick way that we're going to be doing mixing a neutral and finding what that neutral is going to be. So I'll just do this one last exercise, and then that's it for like the oil painting intro information. And you're welcome afterwards to come feel any of the panels if you're interested in trying any of them or anything like that. So let me just move these. I do think it's good to have a couple of bigger brushes for toning or for varnishing. So have a dedicated varnish brush. I like to have these kind of blick larger brushes, but the bristle ones are nice for toning. I always have a couple of those hanging around. So for our grisaille, you're only going to need the ivory black and the raw umber. And I'm going to use lead white for this, and I can actually show you the difference between lead white and titanium. So in a way, we're kind of doing a couple of short strings. So this is my lead white. This is my ivory black. Yes. And this is my raw umber. So I'm going to do this really rough and tumble, but I think you get the idea.
You have a titanium white, or do you need?
I do.
Okay.
I have a already titanium. Okay, so to start, palettes. I would recommend a glass or wood palette. Make sure if it's wood, it's a finished wood. You don't want raw wood because it's going to suck all the oils out of your paint if not. And I prefer for people to not work on a white palette, like the white palette paper. It can be really disorienting when you're doing color mixing and working with values. So I recommend a gray or wood palette. That's a mid value. Okay, so again, our raw umber and black, they kind of look similar out of the tube. So what I like to do is take a little bit of white and then a lot more white. Do a little bit more, distribute like that. So I'm basically making two values with the paints. I want to see what they look like. The white is going to illuminate kind of the color temperature. this is really what we're dealing with right now is temperature. Is that's where we're trying to get a neutral, is that we're trying to find a neutral between our very cold ivory black and our very warm raw umber. Does that make sense? So we like with the grisaille, the reason we don't have it be just use black and white and we'll deal with it from there. The reason we don't do that is because we do think that it's helpful for you to get a sense of some mixing sensitivities just right from the get-go. So we're just doing that with warms and cools here. Now, ivory black tends to be stronger than raw umber. So you see how that's so much lighter than that? I'm gonna add a little bit more paint because I'm trying to create the same values here and here than I am here to here. So maybe I'll just add more. And how much I'm adding is due to like my experience. I know how much to add because I know this raw umber like the back of my hand. All right, so now you see with the white added how much different those paints look, right? So one's very brownish yellow, one's very bluish gray, okay? So how do we mix a neutral? I'm not mixing a neutral, something that's perfectly neutral to the world. I'm mixing a neutral in between my two paints. That's why it's important to be consistent about the brands that you use and the brands you use, because let's say you switch brands of ivory black in the middle of your painting, you may find that your temperature shift is going to be different. Okay, so what I'm going to try to find is I want to make a giant pile of these two paints together that when mixed with white feels like an equal jump to one to the other. Okay, so if I don't know anything, I might say I'm just going to do half black and half brown, see what happens. Okay. Make sure you don't have white on your palette knife. So by looking at it out of the tube, all the tube paints mixed together, it's really hard to tell if you're in between. You're just like blind, right? So in order for me to start determining if I am actually in between, is I need to start adding white to them and seeing what they look like compare. So everything in painting is about comparison. There's no matching to real life. There's no matching perfection. There's no matching in painting, just like there's no crying in baseball. So we are trying to do, it's all relative. It's all how things relate to each other. Okay. So if we have this feels too much like that, I know I need to add more of the other. Okay, so, but I only will know until I start adding some white to test it with. Now, ideally I have more paint here, but I'm just doing this to show you guys. So if I do this and I start testing it with the white, and I can say, okay, at this value, this is leaning way more towards that black than that brown, right? So it's not neutral. So this goes off to the side, and I mix up more of, I add more to my, what would be a good name for this? To my,
Wow.
was it?
Brown.
My brown. Yes, this is my brown. It's now more brown than it is black. Okay, so that's, and ideally I've now shifted that more towards the warm. And how do I know? I'm gonna, again, reset, make sure this is clean. And again, once I've gotten this, and I feel like this is an equal jump, that's what I'm gonna make my value scale from. Because then what happens if I run out of this, if I tube this and I run out of it, how do I match it again? I've got my value scale to match it to. That we can match to. We're not matching to real life though. Okay, so again, we're gonna do this. See if, make sure, you have to make sure your brown was evenly distributed into your brown. Okay, that's better. Do we feel like it's an equal jump? I think I need to add more. So right now the mixture is probably about 1/3 black, 2/3 brown. Roughly, again, it's not an exact thing. We're just trying to find what we feel like is a equal jump in between there. Do we feel like this is equal parts this and that? Do we feel like it's closer to one, closer to the other? Let's add a little bit more because I do think it's a little bit darker. What do we think?
Can you tip it up?
So we got 1/3 black, about 2/3 brown, about roughly. Do we feel like that's a good neutral?
I'm seeing the brown. I'm seeing more of a gap between.
So everybody seems to be saying there needs to be a little bit browner.
Yes.
Okay, so let's make it more. Let's make the brown more brown. So maybe, but maybe not by not as much as I added last time.
Does the reflection of the glass palette bother?
Well, usually we have a lot of lighting from above right now. So I'm hoping that people can see kind of what's going on. But normally when I'm in my studio, I don't have this much light right above where it's like shining back at me. So ideally you have a studio setup that is not blinding like that.
There is no sunlight in our cave.
Yeah, we work from artificial light, so. Okay, so so now we're gonna try to test that out. Okay, how do we like our brown now? Better? Okay, so that's how we would land on our neutral. Let's just assume it's better. So now, and then just to also test is what I'll also do is like take a little bit of that and then just kind of confirm it more with some of the lighter values. So I almost feel like maybe we went a little too brown. Okay, so now I'm going to go back and say, well, actually, you know what? This is going to go. I'm going to go kind of go back to my original mixture, add a little bit more black, and then try this again, and then come to here. And if I feel like they're relatively neutral there, I can feel pretty confident with that neutral. And if I have a big pile of it, that's what I want to do my value string with, and that's what I can then match to tube additional amounts. But trying to match it when it's that dark is impossible because it's so dark. So trying to illuminate the qualities of it with the white is going to help. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so I can show you really quick also the difference between titanium and lead here. And I'm just going to try to show, first of all, right out of the tube, if you look at the two paints, you can see that titanium is much colder. And it almost feels blinding compared to the lead. The lead is a little bit creamier, a little bit yellower. And so this is my magic trick. There's nothing on my sleeves. I'm going to use this like a similar amount of titanium white and then a similar amount of lead white. Would we agree that these are similar piles? Do I need more in one versus the other?
Or lead.
More lead? Are these similar amounts, would you say? And then I'm going to do the same thing with the ivory black. Those are similar? Nothing on my sleeves? Okay. Forgot which one this was.
That's what it
This is the lead. This is actually much more funny to see with alizarin because the chroma difference. And then this is titanium. Okay, so the value difference is pretty significant. So you can see how what I mean by titanium is a bully.
Screaming.
And what you'll also notice is that if I did this with alizarin, alizarin's already like a, yeah, very big difference. So the temperature difference between the two, can you see how this feels a little bit warmer? And this is much cooler. So, I mean, part of it's because of the value, but if I did this with alizarin, you would find that the chroma drops significantly with the titanium white. And that doesn't mean I couldn't get the same pink that I did with lead. It would just require more of the alizarin and actually a touch of cad yellow because the titanium tends to chalk colors up a bit, so you need to introduce additional chroma to hit the same color. Doesn't mean you can't, just means it requires more of the other pigment, or it also means just use less titanium. So if I dumped a bunch of this black in here, I could get to a relatively similar value. It's just different proportions that I would use. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so that's pretty much all I had for this lecture. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of I think this is the information. I really believe that, especially if you're starting painting within our program, this will help ground some of your decisions with the processes that we're going to be doing with our painting. Just keep in mind, our first stuff we're doing is opaque, opaque, opaque. You don't have to worry about glazing. You don't have to worry about transparency. If you find you're getting transparency, that means you're painting too thin. If you're getting too much texture and too much globbiness, you're using too much paint, right? There's a happy medium. So these are the things. I think stay simple. When you're starting to paint, stay simple. Try not to add anything to the paint if you can. That doesn't mean that some solvent will come in handy at the beginning of a painting. If we're going to add oils to our paint, it might be towards the end to make them more fluid or just flow better, that type of thing. So this type of information I thought was really game-changing because I painted on my own and I couldn't figure out what the heck was going on, why my paints were so... I was basically dumping way too much solvent into my paints. It was getting all soupy and uncontrollable, and I ended up with like an underpainting after an underpainting after an underpainting. I couldn't control the paint to any degree. So just make sure that when you are doing layering, the biggest thing to consider is my previous layer dry? If you start painting on a layer that's kind of tacky, it's going to pull up and it's going to get gunky, but you can do a lot with layering. So kind of coming back to this here, where if you can survive an ugly layer, the second layer is so satisfying because you have so much control because this layer is supporting this layer. Okay, and that's what we're doing in our cast program is we're going to do a simplified ugly layer and then we're going to confirm drawing and adjustments and build form with our second layer. We can get to a much different result than we can if we're trying to glob it all on at once. Questions? This is the picture. This was the reference. This is all just using burnt umber and white. I always think like if you're trying to test something out, just like keep it simple, use burnt umber and white. Like those So they're two like just super easy things to use. This is the difference between transparency versus mixed brown and white and transparency with just brown. But this to me is like, this is indirect painting. This is painting in layers. Make sure it's dry. You can do so much in this layer if you have something underneath it supporting it. And this is like, if you just want to do something quick and fast, glob it down and have control over the paint. And that's also fun too, but it's also a little bit less, you can't get as refined. You have to be selective on what you want to put details into. That's it. Question?
I think I heard you say you could do the first layer in acrylic. Is that right?
Yep. If you have an acrylic prime canvas, you could do acrylics on top of that. And then after that, once that's dry, which is usually dry by the end of the day, you could start painting oils on it. Because it's acrylic's dry by evaporation, so that's super fast. And then anything oil on top of that's going to dry slower. Questions?
So how many layers do you typically do?
It depends on what I'm painting. So if I'm painting like skin, a cast, anything soft, fabric, anything that needs very elegant transitions where it's very smooth turning, I'm usually doing at least usually three layers. If it's something like an old weathered lantern, I can probably get away with 2 because like all the variations is all just kind of like choppier paint. Certain textures I can do in 2 layers. Smoke I can do in 2 layers. Well, actually I need a darker layer underneath. So 3, if I'm really feeling like I didn't do a very good job on a section, I might need a 4th layer and I need to revisit it because it was too blotchy or something. So it's all dependent on what I'm doing and why. And if I'm going the scenic route, doing those complex colors, it might take me 3 layers because my theory is if I go red now and I glaze blue over, it'll end up purple, but if it's not the purple I want, maybe I'll add another layer on top of it. Any other questions? Does this help with any of the issues you found you were having with experimenting on your own?
Yes.
It does? Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any other further questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Would you say that for mixing pinks, it's better to use the white instead of the...
You're having trouble with pinks?
Yes.
Yeah, everybody has trouble with pinks.
Yeah.
So, so there's a couple suggestions I would use for pinks. If you're having trouble getting high chroma pinks, do you know what reds you're using? What colors you're using? The pigments?
I mean, everything.
Everything?
Yeah, like
Okay.
the quinacridone.
Yeah, the quinacridones. Okay. So if you're trying to get high value, like bright, light pinks, you may want to try glazing.
Yes.
Because that's where you're going to get those, those are much higher chroma than these. Like these start to dull down when you mix with white. So I do think make sure you're using a brand that has high pigment load, like the, this is Gamblin's red quinacridone, but there's also quinacridone rose, which is really, M grams is really high chroma. So the glazing is going to get you the maximum chroma at the lightest values. But also keep in mind, it's not just what paints you use, it's what you surround it with.
Yes.
So if you are if you're like maxing out, that's what we kind of call about like you've reached the capability of oil paint. If you've maxed out, if you've tried glazing those high chroma colors on white and it's still not bright enough, you just don't have the language. So what you need to do is change what's around it to either the complement or a neutral, like more complementary or more neutral. It'll help. The context will make it feel brighter than it is. So the lead white will get you more chromatic pinks, but at the same time, like there's still gonna be a limitation because mixing with white is going to drop chroma. You can't get as chromatic as if you're glazing on white. Yeah. So you may find like if it's a flower, if you load up the areas you're going to glaze with white and let it dry, then glaze on top of it, you might get to the chromas you want, but it's a little bit harder to control like subtle variations when you're working with transparency.
So when you do glazing,
Mhm.
for example, in this case,
Mhm.
would you use oil for the glazing or do you use some kind of medium? Like what would you do?
So I would do, a paint like Gamblin's red quinacridone or quinacridone rose is already oily enough. Alizarin, already oily enough. You don't need to add anything to it. You're just going to stretch it thin over that surface. If it's most of the pinks are transparent. So I don't think you need an oil to do that. The paint itself is oily enough that you can actually distribute it very easily, almost too easily over the surface. So I don't think you're going to need to. If it's another paint, like let's say I wanted, Prussian blue is a really nice dark, you've seen Prussian blue. Yeah, it's a beautiful color, but it's also pretty opaque. So if I want that to stretch thinner, that's when I'll add like a drop of linseed oil. Stand oil maybe, but just stay simple, just linseed oil, like a drop of it, because that'll just make it fluid enough. If you stretch it too thin, then you just it starts to get like it just wimps out after a certain distribution. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, but the glazing is harder to control. You don't have modifications in drawing. So I find if you want to go the easy route, max out at what the mixing pink is and then modify the context. Any other questions?
Super specific, but what's stand oil?
Stand oil is this is how I remember it. Stand oil stands around for a while. So it's slow drying, but it's like a thicker, viscous oil. So I actually do like it for, like, let's say I do smoke. When I do the textural effect for smoke, I'll paint an area dark, and then I'll actually take white and scrub it. But the problem is with our stream bed, sometimes the linseed oil can actually just be too thin. And if I go to paint on top of it again, some of those, all the lead white gets a little like re-picked up and like redistributed, which I don't want. So the stand oil is a little bit thicker, so it kind of really holds that pigment into place a little bit better. I think it's not necessary to use right away. If you're just starting out, I don't recommend trying to use it.
Yeah.
Use it for more like when you're getting into certain effects where you need very fragile, thin layers to not be disturbed. It does take a lot longer to dry. It's a slow drying oil. So it's longer than it's longer than linseed oil. So you want to use it on the last layers because again, you want to do that fast drying under slow drying. So if I'm using stand oil, it's usually on the last layer because I know it's a slow dryer.
Okay. All right. I just hear it a lot.
Yeah. It's a good oil. It really, it makes a good paint film, but it's very slow drying. Did you have any questions specifically? Because you're relatively new for oil painting. Did all of that make sense?
Makes sense, yeah.
Okay.
A lot of it is like transferable from like acrylic.
Yeah, totally. It is. It's I think the trade-off is like you get to, it stays open. The paint stays available and open and movable and modifiable on the canvas for longer, and you get like a different feel to the paint. Like the appearance of the paint in the end tends to look a little bit different. You can kind of feel out the layers.
Yeah, because I strive for like the smooth finish of oil, but I sometimes achieve it with acrylic.
Yeah, if you sometimes extenders like acrylic extenders can help, and I've seen some people do amazing things with acrylic, but it requires a lot of mastery of the medium. The biggest thing I ran into, because I did acrylics for 10 years, and I found when I switched to oils, all the things that irritated me, like I couldn't get well, it was because of it just closes out so fast. It's those smooth transitions. It's all those smooth transitions where I couldn't get the acrylic to do what I wanted it to do. And like, I mean, I did it for like 10 years. I could get to an okay point, but I felt like once I could transfer all of the information I learned from color mixing and acrylics to oils, just being able to physically blend and soften the paint into each other gets those nonstop beautiful transitions that I was always like struggling with acrylics.
My struggle with oil is like it just stays wet too long.
So you could also swap out pigments that dry faster. So for example, especially for early layers, using Mars Black instead of Ivory Black. Mars Black is super fast drying and can sometimes be dry by the end of the day. And that's great for first layers. For a final layer, Ivory Black is the darkest you can get. So I'll probably do a final layer with Ivory Black if that's the case. So you can swap out slow drying pigments for faster drying ones, or adding a dryer to the slow drying one. So that would be like a little bit of liquid, a little bit of alkyd. But just keep in mind that the added liquid is going to make it more transparent and more a little bit harder to control depending on what you're using it for. You know, we're working very refined, but if you're kind of doing more expressionistic or, you know, experimentation layer after layer, adding a drop or two of dryer to each little plop of paint is not going to be a big deal. Any other questions? Okay,
A lot.
a lot of information. If you have questions, if you have questions about any of this information that you want to follow up on, don't be afraid to email us. If you're new to ARA in Boston and you're interested in any part of like workshops or programs or anything, let me know. And we do have some art history lectures that are free coming up this semester too. So get on our newsletter if you're interested in hearing about those. And I think that's it. But thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.